If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 61 Smash. Crack. Buzz. When Cassen was busy getting drunk at Hagrid's place, the Gryffindor quartet had finally reached the final level. Neville helped Harry dismantle the piston door's outer casing, exposing the redstone circuits within. Harry placed the small redstone block onto the circuit, and with a loud click, the piston door opened. "All right, let's go in," Harry said with a sigh of relief. This door was almost exactly like the one Kasenhis had described in class. If it weren't impossible, Harry might have suspected that Cassen had designed this redstone setup specifically for him. The two stepped through the doorway, their eyes fixed on the figure at the end of the room, standing in front of a mirror. "Mr. Potter, and Mr. Longbottom, how nice of you to join me," said a voice, though it wasn't coming from Quirrell's mouth. "Do you have a speaker hidden in the back of your head or something?" Harry snapped, still wary but unable to resist throwing out some trash talk. He noted that Quirrell didn't seem in a hurry to attack them yet, but his dislike for dark wizards was written all over his face. "Relax, Quirrell. Let me out. Let me see him," the voice from the back of Quirrell's head spoke again. Obediently, Quirrell nodded and began unwrapping the turban from his head, loop by loop. What emerged was a pale, twisted, sinister face, with no nose and a grotesque, snake-like appearance, staring out from the back of Quirrell's head. "Mr. Potter, the last time I saw you, I gave you 2 gifts, the face hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "Your father's death and your mother's death. Likewise, Mr. Longbottom, your parents. I later heard some news about them. I can only say that your parents were brave-o, very brave but utterly foolish. They didn't know how to choose the right side. They stood on the wrong side of history, and that sealed their fate." "Shut up!" Neville roared, his voice trembling with anger. Harry clenched his wand tighter, fighting to keep a sliver of calm, but Neville was past that point. Harry only knew that his parents had been murdered by the man standing before him, leaving him an orphan. He had been forced to live with the Dursleys, and the only glimpses of his parents came from the reflection in the mirror of East. But Neville was different. He had seen what had been done to his parents. He had witnessed the consequences of the Cruciatus curse that had turned 2 brave Aurors into permanent patients at St. Mungo's. They had been tortured into madness by Death Eaters who preyed on them with superior numbers, cowards who had stolen their minds and left them shadows of who they once were. "Oh, I completely understand your desire to defend your parents," Voldemort continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "But before that, you'll need to help me find the Philosopher's Stone that Dumbledore has hidden here. Once I have it, I'll give you both the gift you've been waiting 11 years for." His lipless mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "The gift of merciful death and a reunion with your parents. We won't let you get the stone." "Stupefy!" Harry shouted, his wand already out. He fired a spell with the speed of a Western gunslinger, but the magic was effortlessly deflected by the barrier of power surrounding Quirrell Voldemort's power. "You're just like your father," Voldemort sneered. "He thought he could fight me with just these stupid tricks." Neville, meanwhile, had drawn his wand without a sound. He cast a spell instinctively, one he was most familiar with. A forceful burst of magic shot upward, lifting Voldemort slightly into the air. "Humph! That magic is no better than what a Muggle could muster," Voldemort said disdainfully. "Your parents were far stronger than you could ever hope to be." "Master, shall I kill them?" Quirrell asked, his tone eerily calm. "No," Voldemort replied coldly. "We still need our dear Mr. Potter to help us retrieve the Philosopher's Stone from this mirror. If he refuses, we'll let Mr. Longbottom persuade him. Pain has a way of softening resolve." "Praise your wisdom, Master," Quirrell said, bowing slightly. "Now, dear Harry," Quirrell sneered, his voice oozing malice, "I recall a time when you didn't look at me with such hatred. Before that meddlesome Cassen got involved, I dare say you didn't mind me so much. You're not worthy of saying his name." Harry spat, his green eyes blazing. "That duel on the platform, Professor Cassen should have finished you off." Quirrell's smug expression crumbled instantly, replaced by a snarl of pure rage. Mentioning that duel had clearly struck a nerve. He tore at his sleeve, exposing a grotesque blackened mark crawling up his arm, its ominous, cursed appearance making Harry's stomach churn. "Look at this! This vile curse, this is what your precious Cassen did to me in the Forbidden Forest." Quirrell raged, holding his arm aloft like a trophy of suffering. "You think he's some noble hero? Let me tell you, Harry, your Kasenhis isn't any better than me. If it weren't for my great master's power, I'd have been dead long ago. That so-called professor is no saint, he's just another hypocrite. Quirrell's fury boiled over. He launched himself at Harry, delivering a brutal kick to the boy's midsection. Harry fell to the ground with a groan, but Quirrell wasn't done. Fueled by anger, he began kicking Harry repeatedly, his heavy boots slamming into Harry's sides and back. Each blow was accompanied by a twisted cackle, as though every strike on Harry's body was a small act of vengeance against Cassen. In the corner, Neville watched helplessly, his face pale but determined. His wand was clutched tightly behind his back, and he whispered under his breath, trying to cast one of the spells he wasn't good at, transfiguration. If no spell could directly hit Quirrell, then perhaps. That's not magic, is it? He decided to transform the memory ball bracelet on his wrist into a knife. This should work. If it doesn't, then there's no other choice, this is the only thing he could transform. Longbottom, you don't seem as innocent as you look. Voldemort, residing on the back of Quirrell's head, noticed Neville's subtle movements and commented coldly. Quirrell, realizing what was happening, began walking toward Neville. Don't you all adore that so-called Professor Kasenhis? Where is he now? Can he come save you? Oh, the only thing he can do is cry like a weakling. Why, you ask? Because I remember he cares a lot for his little students. Nearhaha, when he sees your corpses, oh, he'll cry terribly, I guarantee it. Haha! Quirrell roared as he approached Neville. He pulled out his wand, casually flicked it, and a silver light flashed, leaving a bloody cut on Neville's face. Blood gushed out in an instant. Humph! Forget the Forbidden Forest, even that day in the hospital wing, I could figure out who that despicable man who messed with my spine was with just a thought. Isn't he supposed to be impressive? Let him suddenly appear here and save you then. Quirrell kicked Neville's leg, causing him to lose balance and fall to the ground. Then he stomped hard on Neville's wrist, the one wearing the memory bracelet, as if he were trying to shatter it. You don't deserve to mention his name, Neville said, struggling to lift his head. Hatred burned in his eyes as he stared at Quirrell. Quirrell was infuriated by Neville's gaze. He reached for his wand, intending to make Neville suffer the same fate his parents had endured. However, Voldemort's voice from the back of his head interrupted him with a disapproving tone. Do you remember why we're here? Stop wasting time. Quirrell flinched at the sharp rebuke, quickly nodding in submission. Yes, Master, he replied humbly, moving toward Harry. Harry, clutching his aching stomach, finally realized something through Quirrell's taunts. Professor Kasenhis could indeed suddenly appear here. With great effort, Harry reached into the hidden pocket of his wizarding robe, pulling out a dark green pearl. Summoning all his strength, he smashed it against the ground. Crack! Buzz! Chapter 62 He Can't Be Back. What is it, Harry? Where is this place? Kasenhis appeared before Harry, his face slightly flushed and holding half a glass of wine. Clearly, his slightly inebriated brain hadn't quite recalled the significance of the ender pearl he'd handed over. Harry, struggling to breathe, weakly pointed in Quirrell's direction. Kasenhis turned his head and saw Quirrell gripping his wand with trembling hands. Without a word, Kasenhis drained the rest of his wine, tossed the glass aside, and let it shatter on the ground. Crash! Avada Kedavra! Vanishing Curse! The moment the glass broke, chaos erupted. Without wasting time on pleasantries or even glancing at Harry or Neville, Kasenhis summoned his enchantment table. A vanishing curse shot forth, instantly cancelling out the green glow of Quirrell's killing curse. Fiend fire! Quirrell, clearly panicking, reverted to his old tricks. A fiery serpent surged toward Kasenhis, but it was far less intimidating than the one he'd conjured in the Forbidden Forest. Kasenhis clapped his hands together sharply. In an instant, the entire chamber was filled with shimmering blue water source blocks. Kasenhis could move freely within the water for precisely 14 seconds, possibly stretching it to 17 without dying. But within this brief span, dismantling Quirrell, who was now flailing helplessly and unable to even open his mouth for fear of drowning, was laughably easy. As for Harry and Neville, who were also submerged in the water, they just gotta live. In the face of a formidable enemy, there was no room for hesitation. The enemy had to be dealt with first. As long as he pushed himself a little harder, everything could be settled within 30 seconds. Kasenhis's eyes sharpened, and he hurled 4 end crystals toward Quirrell. While the explosions caused limited direct damage underwater, the shockwaves forced Quirrell to swallow quite a bit of water. Now injured internally from the blast, Quirrell began coughing up blood. The crimson liquid floated through the water like wisps of smoke drifting in the air. "Here, you'll love this one," Kasenhis muttered. With that, he summoned the green, square-shaped head of a creeper and jammed it onto Quirrell's head without further explanation. Then, wielding a pitch-black longsword, he slashed. Slash! 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 4 clean strikes reduced Quirrell into a neatly shaped cylinder. Only then did Kasenhis retract all the water from the room. Cough, cough. "Professor Kasenhis, where's Quirrell?" Harry struggled to stand, wiped his face, and asked nervously. "Over there. Keep your distance." "I'll go check on Neville," Kasenhis replied as he noticed Neville unconscious on the ground. Quickly pulling out a sponge, he knelt by Neville and unceremoniously shoved the sponge into Neville's mouth. Gasp! Gasp! Ha! Ha! After the water was drained from his lungs, Neville jolted awake, gasping for air. His wide, frightened eyes stared at the scene before him. Kasenhis suddenly appeared in Neville's line of sight, gently patting his back and reassuring him, "It's okay now. You're safe." At the same time, he didn't stop moving. He pulled a small bottle of Dittany from his pocket and began applying it to the wound on Neville's face. "Harry, how about you? Are you okay?" Kasenhis asked, glancing over. Harry rubbed his stomach. "I think I'm fine." "Ow!" Kasenhis bent down and picked up Quirrell. "You two should head to Madame Pomfrey. I need to see Dumbledore." "Dumbledore isn't at Hogwarts," Neville interjected. "Then I'll take you to the hospital wing first," Kasenhis decided, waving his hand to make Quirrell's body float behind him. He then scooped up Harry, who was struggling to walk steadily, and carried him horizontally across his arms. The group, including a floating creeper like Quirrell, retraced their steps. Along the way, they encountered Hermione anxiously waiting at the logic puzzle set by Snape. "I remember the potions here weren't enough for all 3 of you to pass," Kasenhis remarked, extinguishing the flames by force as he walked toward the small table holding the potions. "No, there were 3 bottles of fire protection potion," Harry corrected. "A large one, which Quirrell must have drunk, and 2 smaller ones, which Neville and I used. But when Snape set up this challenge, he only left 1 bottle of potion." The air fell silent. While the younger students didn't seem to react much, Kasenhis frowned as a vague suspicion began to take shape in his mind. "Forget it, let's get out first," Kasenhis said, brushing aside his vague suspicions as they continued heading out. Along the way, he retrieved an unconscious Ron from the giant chessboard. Finally, after building a platform of blocks to get everyone back through the trapdoor into the room with the 3-headed dog, he let out a sigh of relief. And then he saw an old man with a long, white beard, smiling warmly at them. "Dumbledore, keep an eye on this guy. I'm taking them to the hospital wing," Kasenhis said, handing over the floating Quirrell to the headmaster. With Harry in his left hand, Ron in his right and Neville and Hermione trailing behind, he made his way to the hospital wing. Once there, Kasenhis ensured that 3/4 of the quartet were only suffering from physical injuries that could be treated with potions and a good night's rest. Feeling assured, he finally headed to the headmaster's office. "Oh, Cassen, you're back. How are they?" Dumbledore asked, looking up from his desk. "They're fine. Just superficial wounds," Kasenhis replied, glancing at Dumbledore and then at the still form of Quirrell lying in the corner of the office. "What do you plan to do with this guy?" "I've already informed the Ministry of Magic. They'll be sending someone over shortly," Dumbledore explained. "All right, before that," Kasenhis said, stepping forward and planting his foot squarely on Quirrell's chest. With one hand, he gripped the creeper-like helmet that had been jammed onto Quirrell's head and, with a firm yank, pulled it off. "For your painstaking efforts to steal the Philosopher's Stone, I have to express my deepest admiration. So, let me show you something fun." Kasenhis reached into Quirrell's pocket and pulled out the fake Philosopher's Stone he had crafted, the upgraded 2.0 version. "Do you remember this? I made it for you," Kasenhis said, smirking as he twirled the fake Philosopher's Stone 2.0 in his hand. Dumbledore, sharing in Kasenhis' mischievous mood, reached into the cabinet and retrieved the 1.0 version of the fake stone that had been hidden inside the Mirror of East. "Look here, both of them are fake." This is the grand result of all your effort. Kasenhis, you'll die a miserable death. Quirrell growled through gritted teeth, his voice filled with venom. The reality is, Kasenhis said with a casual shrug, I'll keep living my life, while you, well, you won't be alive much longer. Soon after, Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge arrived at the school gates with 2 Aurors in tow. When they entered the headmaster's office, the 2 Aurors stationed themselves silently like statues, while Fudge greeted Dumbledore and Kasenhis with a bright, overly friendly smile. It was a stark contrast to his earlier attitude when he had initially met Kasenhis and considered throwing him into Azkaban for a few months to cool off. Two-faced, humph. Kasenhis muttered under his breath, a hint of pettiness in his tone. Fudge, still maintaining his polished grin, pretended not to hear and gestured toward the unconscious Quirrell on the floor. I must say, I never would have imagined that the professor teaching our young wizards defense against the dark arts for nearly a term would turn out to be a dark wizard himself. Dumbledore, how could you make such a rookie mistake? Perhaps you should have taken my advice, Fudge continued smugly, and allowed the ministry to oversee Hogwarts. Before he could finish, Dumbledore interrupted him. This is not just any ordinary dark wizard. Take a closer look at the face on the back of his head. That is Voldemort. Fudge's innocent face suddenly stiffened. What did you say, Dumbledore? That's Voldemort. Fudge shook his head crazily and said, No, no, no. Dumbledore, I think you have gone and saw him. I mean you must be confused. The Dark Lord is dead. Chapter 63. That wasn't the right call. You just need to take one look, and you'll understand. That face, twisted and deformed by dark magic and magical mutations, it's unmistakable, Dumbledore said calmly. No, no. Fudge replied, his voice trembling slightly. The Dark Lord died 11 years ago at Godric's Hollow. He was killed by Harry Potter. This is just an ordinary dark wizard. Quirinus Quirrell, the dark wizard you accuse, should be, well. Fudge swallowed hard before continuing, I wouldn't use the killing curse, nor would I subject him to a Dementor's kiss. A regular dark wizard can be locked away in Azkaban. He won't escape. He's not the Dark Lord. He's nothing more than a bold dark wizard, bold enough to act under your nose. But still, just a regular dark wizard. Fudge insisted, though his words seemed more for himself than anyone else. Dumbledore sighed, his disappointment palpable. If Fudge had ordered an Auror to cast the killing curse on Voldemort, it would at least signify that Fudge, while afraid of Voldemort, acknowledged the reality of his return. But no, what Dumbledore saw now was a man so desperate to cling to his position as Minister of Magic that he willingly turned a blind eye, choosing to send Voldemort to Azkaban rather than confront the truth. It was almost the same as letting him go free, differing by only a step or two. You can still look at his face, Dumbledore said, a faint glimmer of hope lingering in his voice. I've looked, and I know this face. Fudge retorted hastily. This is Quirinus Quirrell. Dumbledore, you old fool, ahem. He shook his head vehemently, then turned to the 2 Aurors behind him. Take him away. Kasenhis furrowed his brow, casting a questioning glance at Dumbledore. After a moment of mutual understanding, Dumbledore nodded, albeit reluctantly. In the next instant, a wither skull materialized and shot toward Quirrell. But instead of exploding, it merged seamlessly into his flesh. Almost immediately, Quirrell's body began to collapse and disintegrate, his form unraveling before their eyes. Like a piece of charcoal that had burned entirely, Quirrell's body crumbled into fragments at the slightest touch. Moments later, a wisp of black smoke rose from the remains of his corpse, slowly dissipating into the air. Kasenhis. What did you know, Professor Cassen, ahaha. Fudge said, forcing a tight smile of relief. Since you killed a dark wizard this time, the ministry will let it slide. You might prefer addressing me as Sir Cassen instead, Kasenhis replied with a faint smile. Fudge's expression darkened, but he refrained from arguing further. Without another word, he hurriedly left Hogwarts with the 2 Aurors in tow. This Fudge. Kasenhis muttered, watching the trio from the ministry as they departed Hogwarts grounds through the window. Many years ago, he wasn't like this, Dumbledore said from his chair. He may not have been particularly brave, but at least he. Never mind. He waved the thought away. You did well, Kasenhis. Even if you hadn't acted, I would have arranged for Quirrell to meet his end in Azkaban. Only fools let their enemies slip away right under their noses, let alone 2 enemies, Kasenhis said quietly. Indeed. Dumbledore responded thoughtfully. By the way, Kasenhis began casually, when I was in France, I met Nicolas Flamel. Dumbledore nodded slightly, though his mind was already crafting excuses to exit this conversation if necessary. He said that once you're done using the Philosopher's Stone, you should hand it over to me. Oh, did he say anything else? He also said, ahem. What does Dumbledore know about alchemy? What use is the Philosopher's Stone in his hands, something like that. Dumbledore's face flushed slightly as he awkwardly removed his glasses, pulling out a velvet cloth to clean them. We'll deal with this at the end of the term, he muttered. And you still owe me, let me calculate. The previous alchemy professor's annual salary was. It's here, take it. Dumbledore interrupted, pulling an irregularly shaped red gemstone from his pocket and placing it on the desk. Kasenhis picked up the Philosopher's Stone. Unlike last time, he felt as though the stone's magical power was flowing toward him. Can you sense this kind of magical fluctuation? Dumbledore looked over, pushing his glasses back up the bridge of his nose. It doesn't seem harmful. Let it be. Looks like I'll have to spend some time studying this so-called Philosopher's Stone, Kasenhis murmured to himself. That can wait. What you need to focus on right now is something else. Did you forget about the end-of-term exams? Dumbledore reminded him. I will, but first, I'll check on those 4 troublemakers in the hospital wing. Upon arriving at the hospital wing, Kasenhis found Madame Pomfrey, who informed him that Ron had already woken up, much to his relief. It was a shame he came in a rush and hadn't brought any fruit baskets, but carnations were still an option. With a flick of his fingers, he conjured 4 carnations and walked in. Congratulations, all 4 of you. You managed to survive under a dark wizard's wand. Harry managed a small smile, showing that the physical injuries inflicted by Quirrell hadn't left him in too bad a state. Professor, about that thing on the back of Quirrell's head. Harry began. You're right. It was him, Kasenhis nodded. The previously calm faces of Harry and Neville instantly fell. But now he's dead. Although, not necessarily completely dead. Not completely dead. Harry muttered. Wait, Harry, what are you talking about? Ron asked, looking confused. Well, go ahead and tell them, though it's unlikely anyone else will believe it, Kasenhis said with a shrug, glancing at Harry. Harry took a deep breath and said, Voldemort isn't dead. He was, attached to the back of Quirrell's head. The hospital wing went silent for a moment. Really? Ron and Hermione both turned their gazes toward Kasenhis. It's true, Kasenhis confirmed. Although he's dead for now, it doesn't necessarily mean he's completely gone. He might still be around, just like he was after what happened 11 years ago. But don't go spreading this around, it would only cause unnecessary panic. But Professor, why? A Dark Lord like him is still alive. We should tell everyone, Hermione started. If you were the Minister of Magic, or someone high up in the Ministry, I'd be thrilled to let you handle the publicity. Unfortunately, you're not. In fact, Dumbledore wasn't trying to inform Fudge about Voldemort's survival just to stir up fear, he was trying to organize forces to take him down. And did Fudge agree? Ron asked. Kasenhis replied with a look that needed no further explanation. Oh, the 4 students murmured, all lowering their heads in disappointment. By the way, Kasenhis added, sticking his head back through the door just as he was about to leave. One more thing, you didn't take my words to heart. You chose an alchemical stone over 4 lives, which wasn't the right call. So, Gryffindor loses, 40 points. But don't worry, you could earn it back in, 2 lessons or so. With that, he left the hospital wing, leaving the 4 to contemplate their choices. Chapter 64, Crying 7th Years. Kasenhis left quietly, keeping his contribution under wraps. As for why he only docked a symbolic 40 points. Well, he'd already prepared himself for this outcome. He just deducted enough for the gesture, as if taking more would magically change their behavior. Returning to his office, he pulled out the Philosopher's Stone. He noticed its glow had dimmed slightly compared to when Dumbledore had handed it over, though the difference was marginal. If this keeps up, is it going to crumble into dust in my hands? Would Nicolas Flamel come after me for this? He mused, placing the stone into his pocket. Then he retrieved a stack of parchment and began drafting the final exam. Time flew by, and as the holidays approached, a conflicting mood swept through Hogwarts. The younger students were caught between eagerly anticipating the break and dreading the looming exams. Though to be honest, their fear of the finals wasn't too serious. At worst, they could fail, retake the exams next term, and move on. The idea that failing would result in being held back a year? That was nothing more than a scare tactic passed down among first years. There hadn't been an actual repeat year at Hogwarts in ages. But for the 7th years, the atmosphere was entirely different. These soon-to-graduate students, preparing to leave the safety of the school and enter the working world, were gripped by tension. For them, the thought of a holiday wasn't something to look forward to, it was something to fear. After all, once the final exams ended, who knew when they would set foot in Hogwarts again? The carefree students of the Ivory Tower were about to transform into adults burdened with responsibilities. The naive, self-proclaimed rulers of the world would soon become jaded, bitter individuals contemplating the world's destruction. In the 7th year alchemy exam hall, Kasenhis collected all the test papers and tapped their edges neatly on the lectern. What grades should I give you all? Go ahead, share your thoughts, I might even take them into consideration. The students sitting below stayed mostly silent. Even after turning in their exams, none of them made a move to leave. Seeing this, Kasenhis placed the stack of papers on the lectern, crossed his arms, and sighed. Go on, leave already. You still have to prepare for your NEWTS. Although I will, of course, give you grades so perfect you won't be able to refuse. Okay, Professor, said Charles Mig, the student sitting in the front row. He walked up to the lectern and gave Kasenhis a hug. Some tear dripped from Mig's eyes. Relax, Kasenhis said, patting his back. You might feel sad now, but the moment you walk out of this classroom, you'll forget all about that sadness. You'll realize I was just a passing figure in your life, insignificant, not worth making a big deal over. Cassen shrugged, accepting the farewell hug while trying to comfort the students. Actually, Professor, I will remember you clearly. You won't just be a passing figure, Charles Mig said earnestly while wiping his eyes as he let go. Take it easy. There are only so many wizards in England. Who knows, one day you might see me at Diagon Alley buying ice cream. But even then, I'd like you to still call me Professor. I'm quite fond of that title, Kasenhis replied with a grin. I will, Professor Kasenhis, came the response. The next in line was Cassley. Okay, don't cry too much after leaving Hogwarts. And as for you, never mind, just return to your family and be decent, I guess. Liam, you're Muggle-born. After leaving Hogwarts, make sure to protect yourself. The so-called discrimination inside Hogwarts is just child's play compared to the broader wizarding world. If you encounter danger, run. Stick with other Muggle-borns and don't try to fit into pure-blood circles. You might be eyeing their benefits, but they might be eyeing your life. And don't embarrass Ravenclaw, alright? Don't get scammed. Standing at the lectern, Kasenhis bid farewell to one student after another. Once the last of them had left, he finally stretched his stiff back, returning to his office to start grading exams. From 3rd year to 7th year papers, Kasenhis worked tirelessly, finally finishing the last batch by evening. He double-checked the scores, sealed the exam papers, and placed them neatly on the corner of his desk. The house elves would come to collect them later and deliver them to Madame Pants for archiving in the library. Ugh, grading all those papers is not a job for mere mortals. Standing up to stretch, he wandered around the office, gathering snacks and tea. He then grabbed a novel from the bookshelf and prepared to relax. Setting the snacks, tea, and book on his desk, Kasenhis sank comfortably into his reclining chair, pressing the button to tilt it back as he began to read. But then crack, a sudden sound interrupted him. It came from his pocket. Specifically, from the Philosopher's Stone. Quickly, he pulled it out. Ever since he'd gotten the real gem, it had been transferring its magical energy into his body in a strange, almost unsettling way. The immense magic from the Philosopher's Stone didn't just increase Kasenhis's magical capacity but also unlocked new abilities for his MC blocks. Nearly all the original blocks were now accessible, with the exception of a few cheat blocks and spawn eggs. Even potions had been unlocked, though it remained to be seen if they could rival those brewed by Snape. At this point, the Philosopher's Stone seemed to have been completely drained of its magical energy. Its once crimson hue was gone, replaced by a pale white color, and it eventually crumbled into fine powder. The mighty Philosopher's Stone, reduced to dust, Kasenhis remarked with a sigh. He then noticed that some of the powder had come into contact with the novel he'd left on his desk. To his surprise, the novel began to absorb the powder, merging with it until it transformed into a resplendent, golden book. What the? Kasenhis muttered, baffled. He pulled out his wand and touched the remaining powder with its tip. Instantly, the powder seemed to crawl up the wand, traveling along the rosewood shaft before merging with its core. The powder was now split, half absorbed by the wand, half by the book. Interestingly, the absorption seemed to have a positive effect. At least, that's what Kasenhis thought as he inspected the wand. It felt different. Not damaged, but as though it had gained new abilities, yet lacked the necessary components to fully realize them. Setting the wand aside, he picked up the golden book. When he opened it to the first page, he was greeted not by traditional text, but by an expanse resembling a starry sky. Merlin's beard. This is like Thaumcraft. Chapter 6-5 Magic Crystals and Arcane Workbench. Yup. This is like Thaumcraft. Ha ha ha. P.S. There'll be some modifications from Thaumcraft. Just a heads up. Kasenhis gently ran his hand across the starry expanse on the book's page until he touched the brightest star within it. With a soft hum, the image of a glass lens with golden edges appeared amidst the stars. Kasenhis tapped on it, and the starry expanse rippled, revealing a crafting recipe, 4 gold ingots arranged around a central glass pane. Beneath the crafting grid was a line of text. Thaumic lens, assists in observing and acquiring the world's truths. Kasenhis hugged the Thaumonomicon, studying it carefully. Back in his original world, he had only heard of Thaumcraft as a famous mod but was far from an expert. Piecing together the text and contextual hints, he finally managed to decipher the true meaning of the Thaumic lens. Based on the description in the Thaumonomicon, the lens seemed to be some kind of observational tool. But with the word acquiring thrown in, Kasenhis guessed it wasn't just for observing. It might also involve extracting something, possibly the 4 fundamental elements of alchemy: earth, water, air, and fire. By pointing the Thaumic lens at relevant objects for 3 seconds, it might be possible to extract these base elements. Been ages since I used a crafting table, Kasenhis muttered, summoning one to a corner of his office. He grabbed 4 gold ingots and a single glass pane. Of course, he wasn't about to clumsily place the materials into the slots like some kind of amateur. If he was going to craft, it would be done with finesse and a touch of science. Exactly science. Slowly, Kasenhis began working. He rounded the glass pane and shaped the gold into a casing for the Thaumic lens. Then, he tried to assemble it all, and nothing happened. He picked up the Thaumonomicon again, squinting at the instructions and poring over every detail. Then, at the bottom of the page, he noticed 6 faintly glowing crystal fragments. Curious, he tentatively reached out and touched a red one. A notification popped up: Fire Vis Crystal. He continued tapping on the various crystals: Water Vis Crystal, Air Vis Crystal, Earth Vis Crystal, Order Vis Crystal, Chaos Vis Crystal. What the hell is all this? Kasenhis slumped back into his chair and waved his hand. A bottle of life water floated over from his cabinet, and he took a long swig. Honestly, he'd never encountered so many mysteries in his entire previous life compared to just this one day. The sharp burn of the vodka snapped him back to focus. Kasenhis leaned in again, carefully running his finger over every corner of the page. Eventually, he came to 2 conclusions. First, these magical vis crystals could be mined from nature, most commonly found in the form of pure water vis crystals. Second, his crafting table was wrong. To make this item, he needed something called an arcane workbench. Where am I supposed to pull an arcane workbench from? Kasenhis muttered through gritted teeth as he flipped the pages again, returning to the empty starry diagram. He resumed his strategy of randomly tapping anything that looked remotely promising. Eventually, he found a less prominent star and clicked on it. Arcane Workbench Crafting Method: transform a standard crafting table using a wand. He stared blankly. Transformation? But I don't know the first thing about transfiguration. Frustrated, he pulled out his wand and jabbed it idly at the crafting table beside him. And it transformed. The warm wood surface darkened to a deep brown, and the workbench now featured a layer of dark green velvet atop it. It actually worked. Kasenhis stood in stunned silence for a moment before rubbing his chin helplessly. This makes no sense. Then, his eyes swept around his enchanted office, from the glimmering runes etched into the walls to his wizard robes glowing faintly with enchantments. Actually, yeah, it tracks. He leaned forward to inspect the transformed workbench. Aside from the main work surface, it had an additional small recessed slot, which seemed to be intended for the so-called vis crystals. Never thought I'd end up mining here too. Knock, knock, knock. The door's not locked. Professor Kasenhis, the end of term feast is over, and the house cup is about to begin. Aren't you going to check it out? Jordan from Gryffindor poked his head into the office and asked. Oh, I'm on my way, Kasenhis replied, glancing at his watch. He stuffed the arcane handbook into his pocket and left his office. Oh? It seems you've been up to some interesting things. At the faculty table, Dumbledore raised an eyebrow in mild surprise as Kasenhis approached. How did you figure it out? Kasenhis asked, sitting down. Dumbledore gestured toward him with a knowing smile. You are so concerned about your own image. Attending an event like this without changing into fresh robes, it was a dead giveaway. Right. I forgot, Kasenhis muttered, brushing it off. By the way, Dumbledore, let me ask you something. Do wizards have a history of mining? Specifically mining for magic-infused minerals? Dumbledore stroked his beard thoughtfully. Not much, I'm afraid. Wizards mostly rely on magical plants or the flesh and blood of magical creatures for alchemy, as you well know. If I had to name something, it would be mithril. And even that's rare. He paused before adding, but ever since your enchanting table came into the picture, the demand for mithril mining has dwindled significantly. Ah. Kasenhis awkwardly rubbed his chin. It's not your fault. Why the sudden interest? I was curious, do wizards mine for crystals? Regrettably, no, Dumbledore said, shaking his head. Most magical crystals are purchased from the Muggle world. And even then, the demand is minimal. Only a handful of seers or diviners might occasionally buy them for personal use. Ah, I see. Kasenhis nodded thoughtfully. If you have any particular interest in crystals, you might want to visit Professor Trelawney. She has quite a collection of that sort, Professor McGonagall chimed in, leaning over to join the conversation. Got it, I'll check with her, Kasenhis replied with a nod. Before long, the students below settled into their seats, and a faint smirk crept onto Snape's face. He glanced up at the green banners adorning the Great Hall ceiling, proudly representing Slytherin above the house tables. The Slytherins managed to maintain their winning streak. The house of Jameson was far behind, and his godson Draco was looking very proud. This year was very special, and for the first time in ages, everything felt right in the world. Hogwarts House Cup had only one rightful owner, Slytherin. And its banner flew only one true color, green. Then, of course, Dumbledore rose with a peculiar smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Before we begin the feast, there are a few words I need to share with you all, Dumbledore began, his voice warm yet slightly mischievous. As you all know, our Hogwarts faced an intrusion from an evil dark wizard this year. Thankfully, 4 brave Gryffindors, Harry Potter, Neville Longbottom, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger. Snape's previously smug expression instantly faltered. The smugness vanished, replaced with a tight-lipped grimace. Having worked alongside Dumbledore for so many years, Snape could anticipate the headmaster's shenanigans almost by instinct. The moment Dumbledore stood up, Snape knew precisely what was about to happen, and it was going to be a headache-inducing speech for him and his house. Chapter 66. As expected of an alchemist. Sitting at his seat, Kasenhis cracked his knuckles as he processed what had just happened. Gryffindor's 4 troublemakers, the so-called 4 Little Lions, had just been awarded an outrageous 250 points by Dumbledore. Ha! Silence. More silence. And yet, silence lingered. Kasenhis subtly glanced up at Dumbledore, then over at Snape, whose face was now an impressive display of suppressed outrage. Forget it, he thought, better focus on eating. After the feast, back in his office, Kasenhis rummaged through his collection of materials. Finally, he crafted a crystal ball stand by hand using obsidian, hoping that Professor Trelawney, as an esteemed divination teacher, would appreciate the gift. The last time he returned from France, he'd gifted her a set of tarot cards. However, Trelawney didn't seem particularly fond of them, even though she maintained the polite facade of wanting to repay him with a death prophecy, no less. Since then, Kasenhis had been so spooked that he hadn't dared approach her classroom for quite a while. Let's hope this time my predicted death is a little gentler, he muttered under his breath as he raised his hand to knock on the door. But just before his knuckles made contact with the wood, the door suddenly swung open. "The third eye told me you needed help, but it seems you are faster than I expected," Professor Trelawney said without looking directly at Kasenhis. "Oh, here is a gift," Kasenhis mumbled, unsure of what to say as he handed over the obsidian crystal ball stand. "Thank you. Uruguay, Minas, Gilas, Nocturn Alley, and here," Trelawney replied cryptically, pulling out a large, cloudy, constantly shifting crystal and placing it into Kasenhis's arms. A return gift? Thanks," Kasenhis responded awkwardly, nodding in acknowledgement. Only then did he notice something unusual about Professor Trelawney. He remembered hearing from Dumbledore that Trelawney came from a line of exceptional seers and had inherited the ability to make prophecies. While not all of her predictions hit the mark, the ones that did were undeniably accurate. At this moment, it seemed like Trelawney was in one of those rare, prophetic states. After saying his goodbyes, Kasenhis awkwardly carried the massive crystal out of Trelawney's domain. On the way back, he ran into Professor McGonagall. "Is that from Trelawney?" McGonagall asked, visibly surprised. "Yes," Kasenhis confirmed, glancing at the oversized crystal in his arms. "Remarkable. It's really weird to get something from her," McGonagall said with astonishment. "Yeah, surprising indeed." "Well, I'll go and figure out what to do with this big guy," Kasenhis replied, lifting the crystal slightly. Back in his office, Kasenhis set the giant crystal down. He pulled out a ridiculously small enchanted diamond pickaxe and lightly tapped the crystal to examine it. A small shard fell off the crystal. Kasenhis picked it up and placed it into the corresponding slot on the arcane workbench, testing it in all 6 crystal positions. Finally, it fit perfectly into the chaos magic crystal slot. Chaos. Is it because the future is chaotic and unpredictable, so the chaos crystal is used for divination? Kasenhis murmured. He carefully set the large crystal in the corner of his office and marked the chaos crystal slot on the parchment on his desk with a circle. After finishing this, he pulled out a world map and, with a quill, circled the locations Trelawney had mentioned. These were all world-famous crystal mining sites. However, Kasenhis figured that if these magic crystals could be easily mined at those sites, there would be no need for him to search for them himself. Instead, he could just visit a Muggle crystal market and gather them all within an hour. Seems like these magic crystals are extremely rare, and I'll likely have to go find them myself. Stretching lazily in his chair, he took out the arcane manual again and began poring over its contents. The next day. Splash, gurgle gurgle, splash, gurgle gurgle. Kasenhis splashed water on his face, shaking off the sleepiness from the previous night. He returned to his desk, reflecting on the progress he'd made. After spending the whole night devouring the book, he'd learned something useful: how to upgrade his wand. He pulled out a piece of gold and fiddled with it in his hands. Before long, he had crafted a golden wand tip, which he firmly attached to the end of his wand. Though it didn't immediately seem to have any practical benefit, according to the arcane manual, this addition completed the wand, or more accurately, transformed it into a proper staff. Classes for next term are all set. Feeling good, Kasenhis muttered to himself, sliding his newly enhanced staff back into his sleeve. Leisurely, he left his office, knowing there were no lessons today, or for that matter, across all of Hogwarts. All the students were orderly making their way to the Hogsmeade station, ready to head home for the holidays. After having breakfast and exchanging pleasantries with a few professors, Kasenhis used an Ender Pearl to teleport straight to Nocturn Alley. Nocturn Alley, as it turned out, had more shops than one might expect. However, most were barely surviving, thanks to the fact that many dark wizards either had no money or preferred the fine art of theft. Coupled with the low foot traffic, only a handful of shops managed to stay afloat, primarily those owned by individuals with a strong grasp of dark magic and reliable products. Chief among them was Borgin and Burke's. At least, from Kasenhis's perspective, stepping within the shop's vicinity seemed to have a peculiar effect. Even the foul-smelling dark wizards who probably hadn't bathed in Merlin knows how long appeared to clean up their act somewhat. It was almost as if they were afraid of the shopkeeper. Eek! The screech of the creaky door grated on Kasenhis's nerves as he entered. He winced and turned to address the shopkeeper behind the counter, Borgin himself. "You might want to oil that door," Kasenhis said, his face twisted in mild disgust at the sound. "I'll heed your advice, Professor Kasenhis," Borgin replied with a sycophantic smile. "Has my reputation really spread that far?" Kasenhis asked, a little surprised. You are indeed the most wanted man right now, in a good way that is, Professor Kasenhis. How can I assist you today? Borgin inquired, his voice dripping with deference. I need magical crystals any kind, really. But I'll need to inspect their composition first, and I might chip off a small piece from some of them, Kasenhis said directly. Not a problem at all, Borgin replied smoothly, waving his wand. 3 massive chunks of magical crystals floated out from the back of the shop and landed in front of Kasenhis. Seeing this, Kasenhis pulled out a compact diamond pickaxe. He carefully chipped off small fragments from each crystal, then retrieved his portable arcane workbench to begin his experiments on the samples. After a short while, he sighed and turned back to Borgin. I'm sorry, Mr. Borgin. These crystals aren't what I need. But since I've chipped a bit off, let me compensate you for the damage. Borgin leaned forward slightly, inspecting the crystals and then holding up 3 fingers. Kasenhis nodded, promptly laying 3 galleons on the counter. As he exited Borgin and Burke's, Borgin watched him leave, carefully pocketing the galleons. With a smirk, he muttered to himself, as expected of a big alchemist. Chapter 67 Low Self-Esteem Guy. After leaving Borgin and Burke's, Kasenhis stood in the middle of the street with his hands on his hips. He was pondering which shop to visit next when a commotion not far away caught his attention. A middle-aged wizard was furiously casting banishing charms with his wand to drive away a younger wizard who looked utterly disheveled. The younger wizard clutched a cloudy crystal roughly the size of a basketball in his arms. After driving him away, the shopkeeper returned to his store, while the disheveled wizard pulled out his wand, seemingly preparing to apparate. Seeing this, Kasenhis quickly called out, "Wait a moment." The down-and-out wizard looked over, puzzled. "Excuse me, would you mind if I chipped off a small piece of that crystal for an experiment?" Kasenhis asked politely. The wizard thought for a moment, then set the crystal down. "Go ahead," he replied. Kasenhis nodded, took out his small pickaxe, and carefully chipped off a fragment. He placed the piece into his arcane workbench, and soon, a joyful expression spread across his face. "An order magic crystal. Excellent. Name your price." The down-and-out wizard hesitated before tentatively holding up 5 fingers. 500 galleons? Hold on, let me check. Do you accept upfront cash? Or, we can exchange names and addresses. I'm the Alchemy Professor at Hogwarts, so you don't have to worry about tracking me down or me skipping payment. Kasenhis opened his ender chest ring and looked inside. Unfortunately, most of his semester's salary had already been spent on buying wine. That shameless Dumbledore. I meant, 5. Oh, 5 more fingers? Do you mean 1,000 galleons? Fine, I'll handle it. Stay right here. I'll head to Gringotts and pull off something big, Kasenhis said as he prepared to apparate to Gringotts, mumbling, this will absolutely be the last time. Actually, 500 galleons is fine. The disheveled wizard quickly interjected. 500 galleons it is, then. Here, take a look at these. Kasenhis poured out all the galleons from his ring. This is 320 galleons. I'll need to go back to Hogwarts to get the rest. Want to come along? Kasenhis held the galleons in his arms without letting go, making it clear he wasn't about to part with them yet. Sure. Alright then, let's go. Can you apparate? We'll apparate to just outside Hogwarts and walk into the castle from there. That works, the wizard said, nodding, as he pulled out his wand, gave it a wave, and instantly twisted and vanished. Kasenhis let out a breath of relief and used an ender teleport, reappearing in his office. After securely storing the crystal there, he teleported outside the castle, where he spotted the waiting wizard. Let's go. We'll find Dumbledore. He owes me at least 2/3 of my salary. Though, honestly, it's probably not that much, but he definitely has enough money to cover the difference. The two of them made their way to the headmaster's office. The disheveled wizard looked at the stone gargoyle guarding the entrance and fell silent. I'll just wait here. You go get the money. I won't go up. All right, suit yourself. Wait here for a bit, Kasenhis replied casually, uttering a random password of no particular meaning. This was one of Dumbledore's habits. Common passwords included things like fizzing whizbees, cockroach cluster, and lemon sherbet. Most of these were the ones professors used among themselves to access the office. However, the meaningless ones like Kasenhis just used were specifically intended for situations involving outsiders or students. As a result, the entirety of the British wizarding world outside of Hogwarts staff contained very few people who knew that Dumbledore's passwords were essentially a chaotic mix of sweets. Once Kasenhis entered the headmaster's office, he didn't even have a chance to speak before Dumbledore promptly handed over a stack of 100 galleons, neatly arranged in front of him. The man waiting downstairs is named Remus Lupin. He's a werewolf, Dumbledore stated. Oh. Kasenhis pocketed the galleons and nodded in sudden realization. That explains why the shopkeepers in Nocturn Alley weren't too keen on him. Right. Can I entrust you with a small task? Dumbledore asked. Sure, what is it? What are your plans for the holiday? Well, I'll just roam here and there. I'm thinking of collecting those magical crystals, Kasenhis answered. Since that's the case, how about you help improve his living conditions during this holiday? Dumbledore said calmly. For example, you could use whatever's left from that 100 galleons, plus 2 months of your salary, to hire him as a bodyguard. On full moon nights, he'll find a secluded place to endure it alone, so you won't need to worry. Oh, are you two friends? Kasenhis asked. He was once my student, Dumbledore replied. You don't need to say that, practically everyone in the British wizarding world has been your student. He was one of the closer ones. He joined a group I formed. Oh, sure, as long as he's not some shady dark wizard, Kasenhis nodded. Thank you, Dumbledore said sincerely. Why are you still standing here? Dumbledore asked curiously. 100 galleons isn't enough, Kasenhis replied flatly. What exactly did you buy? Magic crystal, Kasenhis replied. Oh? How big? About the size of a basketball. Dumbledore sighed and got up from his chair, clasping his hands behind his back as he gazed out toward the Forbidden Forest. A basketball-sized crystal. What price did he give you initially? Kasenhis thought for a moment. He held up 5 fingers. Right, 5 fingers, meaning 5 galleons, correct. Dumbledore turned back to Kasenhis with a peculiar look. Kasenhis, suddenly feeling awkward, rubbed his nose. And how much did you end up agreeing to pay? Did you got confused and make a deal for more? Haha, I think you made a deal for 50 galleons, is that right? Still, Kasenhis said nothing, only stroking his chin in silence. Come on, Kasenhis, Dumbledore said, exhaling deeply. Forgive an old man, but I truly can't figure this out. How much did you pay? 100 galleons multiple on that. Dumbledore looked at Kasenhis with an expression that was 1/3 perplexed, 1/3 resigned, and the remaining third filled with pity. In the end, he sighed and pulled out a pouch containing 200 galleons. The remaining 200 galleons. Never mind. I sincerely hope you take a bodyguard along with you on your journey, just as a favor to an old man to look after one of his former students. How about that? Kasenhis pocketed the galleons. Of course, I can do that. But why don't you just give it to him directly? He has a rather fragile sense of self-esteem. Chapter 68 No more unemployed Lupin. How about this request? Okay. Since he's a werewolf, I'm curious if he likes MILF more than normal people. Dumbledore. I shall get going. Cassen nodded and walked out of the headmaster's office. Lupin was desperate, living like an unwanted dark wizard will make you like that. When he was standing alone in front of the headmaster's office, many lost memories of his youth returned and a sense of clarity came, and a wave of shame and guilt after that. As soon as he saw Kasenhis, he lowered his head. Sorry, Mr. Cassen. I only meant to take 5 galleons. No matter how desperate I was, I should haven't. Good for you to come out like this. Here is some milk and I'm not gonna go with that 500g deal. Here are 10 galleons anyway. No, I only need 5. Remus said while gulping the milk Cassen offered, as if it were the best beer in the world. Well, I got 200 more gold galleons from Dumbledore because for you, so just take it, get a bath and eat something I guess. He handed a pouch with 10 galleons. You can check it. No. You're a professor at Hogwarts. I trust you. I should probably get going now, Lupin said with a self-deprecating smile, pulling his tattered wizard's robe tighter as he prepared to leave. Wait, Mr. Lupin. I'll be traveling around the world this holiday looking for magical crystals. Would you mind accepting a small commission, say, acting as my bodyguard? Kasenhis asked, holding the remaining galleons in his hand and giving them a little shake. They're quite heavy, you know. No, I think you should. Lupin instinctively started to refuse, not questioning how this professor knew his name. But before he could finish his thought, a faint thread of magic slipped into his ear and gently spread through his mind. With an almost natural shift, Lupin nodded. All right, but I don't need much pay. 10 galleons will do. However, I would need to manage the money along the way, and for that, While shaking the pouch, Cassen's hand slipped and before Remus could finish speaking, a heavy pouch full of galleons came flying toward his face. Oops, careful. Kasenhis instinctively reached out, trying to catch the bag before it could painfully collide with his newly hired bodyguard's head. But Lupin, showing surprising dexterity, swiftly caught the bag mid-air. Ah, good reflexes. Looks like you're more than capable of handling the job, Kasenhis said as he awkwardly straightened his slightly wrinkled robes. Speed is of the essence. Let's head out right now. Follow me to a place first. Unfortunately, my teleportation can't take passengers. Then how are we getting there? Lupin asked. You're a former Hogwarts student, so you should know Hagrid, right? He has a... No, please, can we not go find Hagrid? Lupin interjected suddenly. Why not? Alright then, you take me via apparition. You know London, right? Let's go there, Kasenhis started to explain but quickly reconsidered, guessing Lupin might just feel uneasy about encountering Hagrid in his current, less than pristine state. He decided not to push the matter further. I know London, but as for a specific address, I'm not sure, Lupin admitted. Do you know Baker Street? Kasenhis asked. Yeah, I know it. There used to be a detective there who kept trying to investigate me, so I'm, quite familiar with the place, Lupin replied awkwardly. Do you know his house? I'm his neighbor. Oh? He lives in 221. So you must. 220 or 222? 222. Alright then. With that, the two left the boundaries of Hogwarts. Lupin placed a hand on Kasenhis shoulder, and with a sharp crack of apparition, they appeared inside the house at 222 Baker Street. Feel free to sit, actually, no, don't sit just yet. I have an important mission for you. Go to Diagon Alley and buy 2 Z9 flying broomsticks. Use the gold from the bag I gave you. I need to work on some planning. Professor Cassen, I think 1 broom is enough, Lupin replied. No, 2. And don't call me professor here, or the guy next door won't stop until he finds out which school I went to teach. Kasenhis voice called out from the garage, followed by the roar of an engine as he drove off, leaving Lupin alone in the house. Lupin looked around at the grand, almost palatial home and then down at the hefty bag of gold in his hands. He shrugged, resigned. Dumbledore was right, the man needs a sensible guard. Letting him roam the world mining on his own would be catastrophic, tisk tisk tisk. Lupin muttered to himself. He waved his wand and apparat, appearing in Diagon Alley. Pulling his hood up to avoid attention, he headed to a Quidditch supply shop. Not long after, Lupin returned to 222 Baker Street carrying 2 shiny Z9 broomsticks. But Kasenhis still hadn't returned. Standing in the quiet, luxurious house, Lupin hesitated for a moment. Finally, he placed the brooms in a corner and plopped down on a long sofa meant for guests. Within moments, he was leaning back and dozing off. Some time later, Kasenhis returned, arms full of self-heating meals and bottled water, which he promptly shoved into his ender ring. Entering the house, he spotted Lupin sleeping on the couch. Walking over, Kasenhis pressed a button beneath the sofa, transforming it into a bed. He grabbed a blanket, gently covered Lupin, then noticed the 2 brooms neatly placed in the corner. Picking them up, he carried them upstairs to begin modifications. The Z9 broomstick's performance rivals the Nimbus series and even surpasses it slightly in terms of straight-line speed. However, the Z9's designer clearly lacked any understanding of ergonomics. The broomstick handle was painfully abstract in design compared to the comfortable Nimbus series. It felt like the difference between a touring bike and a sport bike. Of course, Comet and Clean Sweep don't count here, they're essentially scooters. The Z9's saving grace was that most of its magical circuits were concentrated in the tail, making the broomstick handle more of an afterthought. In fact, the Z9's marketing strategy seemed to boil down to buy the broomstick tail, and the handle is just a freebie. At the moment, Kasenhis was focused on upgrading the 2 brooms. He replaced the abstract handles with more comfortable seats, added a speedometer, a magical navigation system, and adjustable throttle grips. It was essentially a complete overhaul, turning the Z9 into the magical equivalent of a heavily modified Suzuki Hayabusa, a vehicle any parent would panic to see their child riding. Most importantly, the broomsticks could now fold neatly to fit inside his ring without taking up much space. When Kasenhis went downstairs, he saw Lupin awake and seemingly struggling with the sofa-turned bed. The blanket Kasenhis had used to cover him earlier was neatly folded, but Lupin was now trying to figure out how to turn the bed back into a couch. There's a button on the lower left. Just press it, but you'll want to. Bang! Oh, Merlin! Lupin exclaimed, startled. But you'll want to be careful because I forgot to add a damper when I made it. And for Merlin's sake, don't move so fast like you're the Flash. Wait for people to finish their sentences, Kasenhis said, handing over a box of tissues for Lupin to clean up the nosebleed caused by the sudden jolt. Oh, what have you been up to? Professor, Cassen, Lupin corrected himself. Just picking up some survival gear. If all goes according to plan, we might have to rough it in the wild for a few days. Oh, and this, Kasenhis said, handing over the heavily modified Z9 broomstick. By Merlin's beard, is this still a Z9? Lupin asked in disbelief. Of course, it's just customized, Kasenhis replied with a shrug. So, when do we head out? Lupin asked, testing the comfort of the seat while perched on the broom. As for its speed, he didn't dare test that inside the house. Even though he couldn't afford one before, he was well aware of the Z9's legendary reputation. Testing its speed indoors would either result in the broom smashing through the wall, leaving a massive hole, or himself becoming a Lupin pancake, or worse, Lupin jam. Chapter 69 Arrival. The flight is tomorrow afternoon. Cassen said. Lupin awkwardly got off the broomstick. If we're flying on a plane, why did we even buy broomsticks? Because, according to every adventure movie or game ever made, after we land, we'll probably have to find some local guide to drive us to our destination. And that's when the chaos starts: wild beasts, rebel factions, or, worst of all, the guide deciding to rob us. Since we haven't been to this place before, neither apparition nor my teleportation will work. But with 2 brooms, we can avoid all that nonsense and travel much more smoothly. Kasenhis finished his long explanation in one breath and immediately felt his throat dry out. He grabbed the half-full glass of water sitting on the cabinet and took a sip. Then it hit him: this glass of water had likely been sitting there for at least 2 months, somehow resisting evaporation all this time. It was as if the glass had been waiting specifically for him. Without missing a beat, Kasenhis poured himself a fresh cup of milk and drank it in one go. No big deal, he thought, suppressing the shiver of disgust. Here, drink some too, Kasenhis said, pouring a fresh glass and handing it to Lupin. It's good for your health. Thanks. Kasenhis watched as Lupin drank it all down. He couldn't see any immediate effects, but maybe he'd know for sure during the next full moon? The timing's just about right. Come on, Remus, let's grab some dinner. Kasenhis called Lupin over to the garage, where the 2 of them settled into the car, one in the driver's seat, the other in the passenger seat. Even if Lupin didn't want to sit in the passenger seat, he had no other choice. The car didn't have a back seat, and stuffing him into the front trunk wasn't exactly an option. This car looks pretty decent, Lupin said, examining it. You, a wizard, know something about cars. Which is why I said it looks decent. Good eye. Kasenhis revved the engine, and the car pulled out smoothly. What's for dinner? We'll just see what we come across. London's big enough. What even is there to eat in London? French food. Ha 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 ha. For some inexplicable reason, those words struck both of their funny bones at the same time, and the tiny car was soon filled with roaring laughter. In the end, the 2 didn't go for French cuisine but instead found a nearly deserted Chinese restaurant. The entire dining hall was so empty that they were the only customers. Lupin stared at the basket of chopsticks, which looked to him like a bundle of wands, lost in thought. He watched as Kasenhis picked up 2 of these wands and began maneuvering them deftly between his fingers. For a brief moment, Lupin genuinely thought this was some incredibly complex spell that required 2 wands to cast. He even suspected that this seemingly ordinary restaurant might actually be a front for some secret organization founded by Dumbledore, with a direct line to the ministry hidden in the phone booth near the trash cans outside. He was getting carried away. Then the dishes arrived, and Lupin watched as Kasenhis used the two wands to pick up food. I remember the wannabe cool people made fun of me in a sushi restaurant, so I had to learn how to use chopsticks. Kasenhis muttered to himself. Are these utensils? Lupin asked. Oh yeah. I think there's a drawer by the table with forks if you'd rather use those. Don't worry, no one will judge. We're in the 90s and TikTok isn't a thing. What? Aren't you hungry? Just eat. All right. Lupin found a fork, his face red enough to rival the table's chili oil. It was clear that this small embarrassment would stay with him, probably until the moment he came face to face with death itself. After dinner, the two returned home, and Kasenhis tossed a set of keys to Lupin. These are for the guest room on the 3rd floor. It's got its own private bath. Rest up for a bit. Oh, well, thank you. Lupin glanced at the keys in his hand, then at Kasenhis, who was clearly too exhausted to keep his eyes open. In the end, Lupin said nothing more, simply walking quietly to the guest room. Meanwhile, Kasenhis headed straight to his bed and immediately entered a state of temporary death. Early the next morning. What's the plan for today? Lupin asked. We're heading to a military surplus store to pick up some outdoor gear. Trust me, you won't want to be wearing robes or overcoats in a mine. The two arrived at a military surplus store and each bought 2 sets of thermal underwear, black camo jackets, heavy-duty coats, and boots. Try it on and see how it fits, Kasenhis said, tossing a set of clothes to Lupin. Lupin caught the bundle and glanced at the price tag. Honestly, I think my current coat is fine, and didn't we agree that I'm handling the money for this trip? That's right. The galleons are with you. I'm using pounds right now, Kasenhis said with a shrug, sounding completely casual. But there's no way these scraps of fabric stitched together should cost this much, Lupin whispered to Kasenhis, casting a nervous glance at the store owner. Listen, it's not just wizard clothing that has its own magic. Muggle clothing has something called technology. It's actually pretty useful. Trust me on this one, you're not as familiar with this as I am, Kasenhis reassured him. Oh. Okay. After finishing their shopping for gear and equipment, the two had a simple lunch before setting off on their journey. To be honest, England does have its fair share of good food, and Kasenhis would absolutely reject anyone's criticisms of English cuisine. For example, the cheeseburger in his hand. After finishing their burgers, the two waited a while longer before boarding a flight to Uruguay. Lupin sat in his seat, staring out at the sea of clouds below through the window. How long is this flight going to take? Zzzzzzzzz. Young people these days, Lupin muttered, shaking his head. Fall asleep as soon as they sit down. Late at night. How long have we been flying? Lupin asked. About 14 hours, I think. Kasenhis said, glancing at the pitch-black night outside. We'll head to the hotel first. Hopefully, they speak English in this country. Hey? They don't speak English. Not every country speaks English. What's so strange about that? Then how are we supposed to communicate? Lupin asked. Don't worry, trust my language skills. Uruguay was previously a Spanish colony, so they speak Spanish here. And wouldn't you know it, I just so happened to take a few Spanish classes back in university. I think it should be enough to get us to a hotel, Kasenhis said confidently, hands on his hips, practically glowing with self-assurance. And then he was met with a taxi driver who started chanting something that sounded like incomprehensible spells to him. What the fuck? Ahem. After a Herculean effort that involved gestures, miming, onomatopoeia, and eventually finding a translator, the two finally arrived at their hotel. Kasenhis booked 2 rooms, quickly took a shower, and collapsed onto the bed, passing out almost instantly. Honestly, there's something about sleeping on a plane that just makes you even more tired. At this point, he almost felt like he was ready to die from sheer exhaustion. Chapter 70. If the Aurors don't get you, the police will. The next day. Are we heading straight to the mine, or what's the plan? Lupin asked, sitting across from Kasenhis in the hotel restaurant. No rush, we'll chew, chomp, chomp. We'll first check out the Muggle Crystal Market. Chew, chomp, chomp. If we don't find anything there, we'll head to Uruguay's Wizarding Market. Chew, chomp, chomp. And if neither of those work, then we'll go to the mine as a last resort. Alright, but what about the language issue? Haha, don't worry. I couldn't sleep last night, so I went home and dug up my old university Spanish textbook. Now I should be able to communicate just fine. As he spoke, Kasenhis casually waved over a passing restaurant server. Ahem. I'd like, one, in a glazed bottle, frozen, sealed, sparkling wine. In Spanish. Close enough. This is probably how foreigners feel reading those sample letters, lol. Soon, a bottle of champagne was brought over in an ice bucket. Kasenhis poured 2 glasses and clinked his with Lupin's. To celebrating our successful discovery of the crystal. But Kasenhis, we haven't actually found it yet. So what? It's just a little early celebration. Nothing wrong with that. The two exchanged a look. Fair enough. Drink. Before long, they left the hotel and hopped into a taxi. Kasenhis immediately showcased his linguistic skills. Oh, good morning, esteemed madam, I mean sir. Might I inquire whether you could kindly kidnap, transport us to your esteemed land's most renowned crystal trading location? I shall, of course, compensate you appropriately for your servitude. Labor. Taxi driver, you can just speak English. Oh? Is my Spanish that bad? Kasenhis asked, his smile falling. Ah. No, your Spanish is pretty good. The driver replied casually as he started the car. I know, right? Cassen beamed. Yeah, you are like a little Shakespeare. Lupin, I don't think that was a compliment. Lupin sat beside him, watching as Kasenhis previously fair and happy face gradually turned red. Silently, he pulled out his wand and started running diagnostic spells on him. Honestly, Kasenhis' expression was a little concerning. It looked almost like he'd been hit by a blood-bursting curse. But after a thorough check, Lupin confirmed it wasn't a curse at all. It was just Kasenhis being embarrassed. Relax, on second thought, being called a little Shakespeare is basically a compliment, isn't it? Lupin patted his shoulder reassuringly. Cassen rolled his eyes. If you spent years learning a foreign language, then said a whole speech only to be told your vocabulary is so outdated that even someone's grandmother wouldn't use it, how would you feel? Wait, so aside from Spanish, you know other languages too? I know Mandarin too. But that's not the point. The point is, it's unbelievably embarrassing. You should try it sometime. I think I'll pass. I only know English, and some half-baked, can write but can't speak runes. Lupin quickly shook his head. That's fine. Runes don't need to be spoken to work. After a while, they got out of the taxi, and Kasenhis, ever the meticulous planner, made sure to save the driver's phone number. At least communication wouldn't be a problem. They entered the massive building in front of them. This was where all the crystals mined in Uruguay were first gathered before being shipped worldwide. Walking in, Kasenhis had to admit it was essentially a huge, unfinished shopping mall. The shelves were packed with countless crystals, piled up as if they were free for the taking. Oh, my dear lady, would you mind if I licked? Chipped off a small piece of your big jewels? If it's what I need, I will offer you a price you cannot refuse. And even if it's not, I shall still provide due compensation for your time. Maldito abusador. Did you just call me a fucking molester? Ow. Think she's calling the police? Lupin, let's run. I think she's crazy. In another shop. Oh, esteemed sir, might I trouble you to let me take a sample of your long and thick crystal? Oh. Sir, please refrain from hitting my head with that stick. That is highly unsafe. Lupin. Come here. Oh, esteemed sir, look at my companion, he is incredibly strong. Don't be fooled by his slim build, he's got muscles in his bones. I guarantee he'll use his spiked riding boots to kick you right in the... Wah. Ah. Hijo de... Cabron. Te voy a matar. As Kasenhis was dragging Lupin away while running his mouth, a wooden stick came flying from behind and smacked him right on the head. Instantly, he whirled around and let loose a spectacular display of linguistic talent complete with an ancient British tradition, the almighty middle finger. A rapid-fire string of classic Old English profanity burst forth, leaving the furious shop owner momentarily stunned. Think he's confused? Kasenhis muttered to Lupin. Maybe. But look, he's reaching into his pocket. Do you think he's got a weapon? Lupin observed warily. Kasenhis turned his gaze just in time to see the man pull out a switchblade. Hoo boy, this guy means business, Kasenhis murmured. Strictly speaking, we were the ones who started it, Lupin pointed out. I don't need you to remind me, Kasenhis huffed as he reached into his own coat. A moment later, he pulled out 2 thick wooden clubs, each about 40 centimeters long. All right then, time for a good old-fashioned righteous brawl. Then, they saw the shop owner put the switchblade back into his pocket and pull out a .44 caliber Truth brand carbon-based life-form calming device. Kasenhis and Lupin exchanged a look. The former murmured, "What now? Should we hit him with a spell? There are too many people here, plus security cameras. Most importantly, we're wizards, and we flew here on a muggle plane. Technically speaking, when wizards travel abroad, they're supposed to notify the Ministry of Magic, get official authorization, receive a portcat, and then be issued temporary magical visas upon arrival. So, stacking up all these violations, we're looking at, minimum, 20 years, Lupin said, taking a deep breath. 20 years. He's pointing a gun at us, and we can't fight back. Using magic in front of muggles, especially the more witnesses there are, comes with harsher penalties. You could blow up the Ministry of Magic in a wizarding area and it still wouldn't be considered as severe as breaking the statute of secrecy. As for fighting back, we're technically undocumented in the Uruguayan magical community, meaning their laws don't protect us. What if we just teleport out? Theoretically, no one would know it was us, right? You have a very recognizable face. By the time we make it back to England, even if Dumbledore pulls some strings, we'd still have to pay a massive fine. Thanks for the compliment. That part we can leave to Dumbledore, he's loaded. And mandatory community service in Diagon Alley. I've done it before. Are you fast at running? Very fast. I'll count down from 3. 1. Bang. A gunshot rang out. Luckily, the shot was fired at the ceiling. The shop owner, however, had been struck squarely on the head by a thick wooden club. Run, Lupin. If the Aurors don't get you, the police will. After throwing down the club, Kasenhis grabbed Lupin and bolted. Chapter 7 1WHOA. A purple legendary drop? This place sure is quaint. After escaping from the marketplace, Kasenhis and Lupin barely had time to catch their breath before spotting police cars speeding toward them, sirens blaring. Oh, hell! Back to the hotel. Without hesitation, Kasenhis teleported away, while Lupin fumbled to pull out his wand BZZT, and vanished with a loud whoosh. Here, drink some water. Once you're done, we're heading straight to Uruguay's wizarding market. Lupin chugged down a bottle of water and gave Kasenhis a deadpan look. Then why didn't we just go there in the first place? Proper wizards don't mine. And wizards only use crystals for divination. I was hoping to go straight to the source to make things easier. Kasenhis unfurled a detailed map on the table. All we have to do is look for an area with no buildings, but a lot of people. That's probably where wizards gather. Lupin leaned over and watched as Kasenhis used 2 fingers to shrink and adjust the map's view, zooming out until the entire country of Uruguay fit on the screen. His jaw dropped. What the hell is that magic? Talent and hard work. Found it. The two made their way to the hotel rooftop. Kasenhis pulled out a shimmering, pale purple glow, the magical essence of an invisibility potion. As for why he was extracting just the magic instead of drinking it like a normal person, well, that was just how he did things. Ahem. Clothes still needed to be worn. Extracting the magic from the potion allowed their clothes to turn invisible as well. Very user-friendly. Before long, the now completely invisible duo rode their flying brooms to a mountain range far from the city. This is Uruguay's wizarding market. Lupin was confused. The wizarding world's productivity wasn't great, meaning that, strictly speaking, wizards still relied on the Muggle world to survive. A proper wizarding settlement, built in the middle of nowhere like this? He'd never seen one before. Well, if this isn't a secret underground fortress of some mysterious organization, then this has to be the place. Kasenhis walked ahead, map in hand, while Lupin held his wand at the ready, following closely behind. Soon, they came across massive tree houses scattered throughout the area, with a large clearing at the center, densely packed with market stalls. There aren't that many people in Uruguay, but there sure are a lot of wizards. Lupin was surprised by the sheer density of the crowd. Let's head in and take a look. They walked deeper into the market. No one stopped them. Nice. Good community. After circling the market over and over again, Kasenhis and Lupin finally admitted defeat and approached a vendor, resigned. Excuse me, but why doesn't your market have any magical crystals? It's useless. If anyone wants crystals, they just go to the mines and pick them themselves. They're worthless anyway. Kasenhis and Lupin exchanged glances. Mines. The Muggle mines. Just wait until no one's around or slap on a disillusionment charm and walk right in, the vendor explained. You don't sell them here. I have some, but I can't understand why anyone would actually buy this stuff. It's completely useless. As he spoke, the vendor disapparated, only to reappear moments later, carrying a massive stone sphere. Crack this open, and there's your crystal. Lupin, pay up. After his previous experience, Kasenhis had no intention of pulling out his little pickaxe to chip away at the crystal himself. Instead, he quickly gestured at Lupin. Just, give him something for courtesy's sake. In the end, Lupin haggled with the vendor for ages, before finally handing over a whopping 3 galleons. Kasenhis immediately took the stone egg aside and gently tapped it with his diamond pickaxe. With a sharp crack, the stone split open, revealing the beautiful, transparent crystals inside. Without hesitation, he chipped off a small fragment and placed it on the arcane workbench. Water-aligned monocrystal, What's this purple one? Just as Kasenhis was about to revel in the joy of obtaining a water monocrystal, his eyes caught a faint streak of purple that seemed out of place. He tapped it lightly with his diamond pickaxe and chipped off a small piece. Earth-aligned monocrystal. Kasenhis was just about to straighten up and celebrate when Lupin quickly pressed him down. What's wrong? You figured it out, didn't you? You were about to go ask the vendor where he found this stuff, weren't you? Lupin didn't answer immediately but instead questioned him back. Yet. Then wipe that grin off your face, look a little disappointed, and maybe even let out a sigh before you ask. Oh, right. That actually makes sense. Kasenhis nodded, coughed twice, and forcibly suppressed his excitement before heading back to the vendor. Sir, where did you find that stone egg? Just go to Amethyst Mine. Any Muggle around here could point you to it. Would you mind marking the location on my map? Kasenhis pulled out his magical map, quickly turned off the feature that displayed moving red dots representing people, and handed it over to the vendor. The vendor pulled out a quill, marked a small dot on the map, and said, it should be around here. The shallow mine crystals have already been claimed by Muggles. If you don't want to get caught or if you're looking for higher quality ones you should head for the deeper sections of the mine. Thank you, generous sir. Kasenhis quickly rolled up the map, tucked the crystal stone egg that Lupin had been eyeing into his ring, and hopped onto his Z9 broomstick. Without wasting any time, the two of them took off, soaring towards the mine the vendor had marked. Before long, they arrived near the mine, cast disillusionment charms on themselves, and casually strolled right in. At some point, they even switched into camouflage gear, all while being passively observed by a group of unsuspecting Muggle miners. As they ventured deeper and deeper, the artificial mining lamps became sparser and dimmer. Kasenhis waved his wand and cast night vision charms on both of them. Soon, they saw them stone eggs identical to the one the vendor had. If not the same, then definitely identical. Prioritize the ones with magic, the purple ones. I think I came across a book in Hogwarts library about crystal cultivation. We just need one crystal seed to start growing more ourselves. Got it. Lupin used a severing charm, and Kasenhis wielded a diamond pickaxe. Before long, one stone egg after another cracked open. Most contained water-aligned monocrystals, and naturally, every last one of them was stuffed into Kasenhis ender ring without hesitation. As for whether this would end up stuffing his office full of crystals again. Absolutely not. For some reason, whether the mine layer was too shallow or something else, most of the purple crystal stone eggs turned out to be non-magical. The ones that did contain magic? All water-aligned monocrystals. After some painful reflection, Kasenhis finally understood. Since it's called earth-aligned monocrystal, it only makes sense that it would be buried deep in the ground. So. Crack. Whoa. A purple legendary drop. Chapter 72 Milk and Grinding Wheel. Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Evening. Look at this now, this is a proper wizarding hub. Although, still not English-speaking. Kasenhis and Lupin, wands in hand, slowly passed through a massive wooden gate, and just like that, the magical world of Brazil unfolded before them. I can only say, they sure know how to party at night. They even have a bonfire festival going on. The two of them found a seat on the open-air terrace of a tavern's second floor. Soon enough, Lupin returned with 2 massive mugs of beer, big enough to make any wizard do a double take. He carefully examined both drinks, gave them a sniff test, and only after confirming they weren't poisoned did he finally set them down with peace of mind. Meanwhile, on the other side of the table, Kasenhis was fully engrossed in reading a letter. This was a valuable lesson he learned back in Uruguay. What's that saying again? The more friends you have, the more paths you can take. After all, he wasn't completely unknown in the world of alchemy. Sure, Brazil was in South America, not Europe, but there were still quite a few Brazilian alchemists who knew of him. Take this letter, for example. The sender had meticulously detailed Brazil's wizarding entry points and even marked 2 specific crystal mines, Minas and Quilas. Gotta admit, this beer's not bad. Butterbeer's nice and all, but compared to this, it's a bit too sweet. Kasenhis took the hint and put the letter away, raising his beer mug and pouring it straight into his mouth. Yet. When are we heading out? Lupin asked. Tomorrow, maybe. I mean, look at this place, it's so lively at night. Honestly, I'd feel bad going to sleep instead of soaking up the atmosphere. It'd be a waste. Kasenhis gazed at the massive bonfire below, a bit wistful. That works, but I can't drink too much. This isn't England, we need at least one of us to stay sober. Fair enough. Kasenhis shrugged, finishing his beer in one go. Immediately, thanks to the tavern's magic, his mug refilled itself at lightning speed. A glowing number 1 appeared on the side of the glass. Oh? That's pretty neat. A built-in counter? What, afraid I'll start feeding the fishes? Who knows? Lupin nodded, amused. The two of them chatted aimlessly, letting the conversation flow with the drinks. Kasenhis ranted about Dumbledore's shamelessness tricking poor professors out of their hard-earned salaries. His mischievous students, those troublemaking little wizards, his tsundere colleagues. Lupin, on the other hand. After 3, maybe 4, or was it 8? Beers. Kasenhis had already lost track of the number glowing on Lupin's mug. He finally loosened up. For the first time, he spoke about his real identity. Even though he assumed the professor sitting across from him, now looking rather dazed and unfocused, had probably already known. After all, Dumbledore must have told him about the whole werewolf thing long ago. But no matter how much Dumbledore wanted to protect him, there was still a difference between someone else saying it and saying it himself. So you were a wizard boy, and then you became a heek. Kasenhis let out a small hiccup, sobered up just a little, and then lowered his voice. A werewolf wizard. Yes. Lupin admitted without hesitation. He had never liked lying to his friends. Even if the friend sitting across from him already knew, he still needed to say it out loud. Not because of some dramatic reveal about being a werewolf or anything like that, it was just about honesty. Because if he didn't say it himself, he wouldn't be able to get past it. Actually, there's a chance, just a chance, that your werewolf wizard situation might not be permanent. Kasenhis tilted his head, his bangs slipping over his eyes as he shook his head and brushed his hair back. Remember that milk I gave you back in Baker Street? What about it? Lupin asked, frowning slightly. That milk heat can neutralize poisons or, to be more precise, curses from black magic. Pretty much heek. Anything that's an external force affecting the body. After I found out you were a werewolf from Dumbledore, I made sure you drank it. Why do you? You have a weird look in your eyes, let me show you. Kasenhis rested his chin on one hand, thinking for a moment before pulling out a small bottle of fire protection potion and sliding it over to Lupin. Drink this. It's heek. Fire protection potion. Lupin didn't hesitate. He grabbed the bottle, uncorked it, and downed it in one go. Seeing that, Kasenhis took Lupin's hand, and instead of leaning lazily on his palm, he summoned a flame in his other hand. And then held it directly under Lupin's palm, roasting it like a piece of toast. Heh, not bad, hey? The effect is great. Drink this, and you could swim in lava. Kasenhis said smugly. Nice craftsmanship. Now, drink the milk. Kasenhis pushed another glass of milk over. Lupin downed the milk, and under Kasenhis' instruction, reached out once more toward the flame. The moment his fingers made contact, he yanked his hand back immediately. Ow! Cold sweat instantly broke out all over his body. He stared at the empty milk glass, his face pale. This actually works? You're not messing with me, right? His eyes were wide with disbelief as he stared at Kasenhis. Kasenhis shook his head. Of course not. I wouldn't lie to you. But the thing is, I don't actually know how your condition works. I've never researched werewolves before. I don't know if your body is infected with some kind of werewolf toxin or if you've been fully transformed into a werewolf. So, Kasenhis hiccuped, then continued. If it's the first one, the milk works. If it's the second, it doesn't. Lupin's heart sank again. For so many years, he had studied his own condition in detail. Of course, he understood the difference between the two. And of course, he knew that he had already been completely transformed. This so-called werewolf curse wasn't some external infection. It was part of him. So naturally, this miraculous milk wouldn't do a thing. But at least you ran into me. Slurp. Kasenhis took another sip of his drink, then grinned slightly. In a way, there might still be another option. Lupin gave him a surprised look, watching as Kasenhis continued to gulp down his beer. The next moment, he vanished along with his beer glass, instantly reappearing behind Lupin, one hand steadily holding his back. By the way, what do you think of my teleportation magic? It's not apparition. Kasenhis casually returned to his seat, speaking with a slight slur. It's very impressive. And this is what I meant: if your situation is the second type, I might still have a way to help you. As he spoke, he placed a grindstone on the table. Then, without hesitation, he pressed one hand firmly against it while the other gripped the handle. And began spinning it. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Kasenhis, what the hell are you doing? Self-harm. Lupin leapt forward, half throwing himself across the table, forcibly yanking Kasenhis' bleeding hand away from that damned grindstone. Blood was already dripping down his fingers. Lupin immediately pulled out a bottle of Divinity, carefully applying it to the wound, watching as the deep cut gradually sealed up. Even after that, he still whipped out his wand and cast a fully powered vanishing spell on the bloodstains left on the table. Just in case some lunatic decided to use his blood for a cursed ritual. Chapter 73 Monocle. Kasenhis clenched his fist, feeling that his palm had stopped bleeding. He shook his head with a hint of disappointment. You shouldn't have stopped me. You should have looked at the magical symbols the grindstone scraped off my skin. Every person has magical symbols, human symbols, wizard symbols. The reason I can teleport is because I've enchanted myself with ender symbols. So, if I can find a way either by overwriting or erasing to remove your werewolf symbols, then theoretically, you should be able to return to being an ordinary wizard. Lupin nodded. Understood, understood. But I sincerely hope next time, you tell me this while you're sober, and without, using yourself as an experiment. Kasenhis took another sip of his drink, closed his eyes, and nodded. The next moment, two shadows loomed over them, blocking the light. Kasenhis and Lupin simultaneously turned their heads, looking at the two newcomers, one tall and fat, the other short and thin. The tall, chubby one wore a constant grin, the short, skinny one looked perpetually miserable. Both were gripping their wands. Their intent didn't seem friendly. Pardon the intrusion, but may I ask, are you the English alchemist, Kasenhis? The smiling wizard inquired. Kasenhis let out a lazy hiccup. Never heard of him. Who's that? The smiling wizard glanced at the frowning one, who pulled out a neatly cut section of newspaper and handed it over. The grinning wizard promptly slapped a large photo of Kasenhis onto the table. This isn't you. Kasenhis shook his head. Nope. That guy, he's way better looking than me. You're really saying this isn't you? It's not. Are you sure? Absolutely not. This is you. No, it isn't. This is definitely you. No, it's not. This is fucking you. Expelliarmus. Just as the grinning wizard burst out in frustration, Lupin's wand flicked instantly, sending a streak of red light flashing across the table. The grinning wizard's wand was immediately blasted from his grip. The frowning wizard reacted quickly, reaching for his own wand, but before he could finish his incantation, Lupin hit him with a well-aimed spell, freezing him in place on the spot. Lupin then casually plucked the frowning wizard's wand away, straightened up, and looked down at the two wizards from above. Believe me, gentlemen, you do not want to experience the Cruciatus curse. Kasenhis, who was sitting back and enjoying the drama at point-blank range, took a tactical sip of his drink. He hadn't known Lupin could even cast the Cruciatus curse before. Though, to be fair, while the spell was considered an unforgivable curse, there weren't really any hard restrictions on learning it. If you had 3 galleons to spare in Nocturn Alley, you could buy a book detailing the incantation. If you browsed the Hogwarts restricted section, you could find records of all 3 unforgivable curses. So, when it came to actually learning them, there really wasn't much of a barrier to entry. Most wizards knew how to cast them, but some chose not to use them, and others just weren't capable of it. Watching Lupin's slow, deliberate threats against the two wizards, Kasenhis took another sip of his drink. Lupin was probably one of the ones who didn't like using them. But judging by the eerie glow reflecting off their terrified faces, Lupin was definitely not in the can't use it category. Soon enough, the two wizards scurried off, tails tucked between their legs, too scared to even ask for their wands back. Lupin walked over to the edge of the balcony, watching them disappear into the distance before finally relaxing. He turned to Kasenhis. Why were they looking for you? Probably because I'm an alchemist, Kasenhis guessed, shrugging. A real one. One who can actually turn things into gold. Someone must have gotten greedy. And somehow, they also knew I was here. Lupin sighed. Well, that's unfortunate. Looks like our night out is getting cut short. Or, we could just head into the Muggle parts of the city, he added. Since, no matter where we go, anything involving me needs to be kept under wraps anyway. Fair enough. Kasenhis got up. Then paused. Wait, hold on, let me steady you for a bit. Lupin frowned. Why don't you just drink a glass of milk? Drinking is for that beautiful, warm buzz, Kasenhis slurred. If I drink milk now, what was the point of drinking in the first place? After settling the bill, the two of them staggered toward the exit of the Wizarding District only to find their way blocked. Kasenhis blinked. Two familiar faces stood in front of them. The same fat and thin wizards from earlier. Oh, for Merlin's sake, does this place have an anti-apparition jinx? Lupin nodded. They just put one up. He swiped his wand across the ground. A blood-red line of fire flared to life at their feet. Believe me, none of you want to find out what fiend fire feels like. The apparent leader of their opponents started to speak. You two may be strong, but you're outnumbered. Before he could finish his sentence, a wither skull slammed into his chest with full force. Boom! With Kasenhis launching the first strike, Lupin followed up immediately, directing the fiend fire on the ground to surge forward. In seconds, the raging flames had devoured two wizards, while a well-aimed blasting curse sent another one flying into pieces. The 2 versus many fight had suddenly turned into a 2 versus 2. And, of course, the last two standing were none other than Fat Wizard and Thin Wizard. The two of them stood there, trembling. Aye. Lupin raised his wand. Against two unarmed, defenseless enemies, he hesitated to go for the kill. Instead, he spoke a single incantation. Obliviate. With that, the two left the Wizarding District. Neither of them felt like sightseeing anymore. In the dead of night, they checked into a hotel and slept straight through. The next day, after a quick breakfast, they mounted their Z9 broomsticks and headed for the Mina's mines. Over the next 2 days, Mina's mines collected a 20-kilogram chunk of fire affinity magic crystal. Gila's mines dug up 2 wind affinity magic crystal geodes. That night, under the crackling campfire, Lupin watched Kasenhis turn over 6 small crystal shards in his hands. Judging by that look on your face, you've finally gathered all the crystals, haven't you? In that case, I guess it's time for me to head back to England. I mean, let's be real, after this whole trip, it's pretty clear you never actually needed me as a bodyguard in the first place. Lupin said while shaking his head helplessly. Hold on, no need to rush. Kasenhis set down an arcane crafting table, carefully placing the 6 elemental magic crystals into their respective slots. Next, he pulled out 4 gold ingots and a glass pane. A moment later, a magic lens about the size of his entire face took shape. This looks kind of ugly. Kasenhis fiddled with it again, resizing it until it was a sleek, single monocle. He clipped the magic monocle onto his eye socket and turned to Lupin. "Looks stylish," Lupin complimented. "Obviously, I'm always stylish. But hold still for a second." Kasenhis peered at Lupin through the monocle. Almost instantly, 3 glowing words appeared on the lens. "Human magic beast." He took out the magic manual again, and a page of it had been opened, and the 3 elements revealed by the monocle had been recorded on it. Chapter 74 Enchanting Lupin. "What a shame." Kasenhis shook his head helplessly as he looked at Lupin. What's wrong?" Lupin asked. "That bottle of milk didn't work on you. Gonna have to figure out something else." "No big deal. I've gotten used to it after all these years." "Tisk, must be tough." Kasenhis paused before suddenly asking. "How long until the next full moon?" "About 2 days, give or take." Lupin answered casually. "Got it." Without another word, Kasenhis placed a sharpening wheel on the ground, pulled out his magic manual, and sat down cross-legged. "Do you trust me?" Lupin glanced at Kasenhis, then at his own hand, and without hesitation, sat down and placed his hand on the grinding wheel. "Hold still." Kasenhis pressed down on Lupin's hand with one of his own, while the other hand spun the wheel. One by one, magical symbols flew out from Lupin's palm, drifting into the air before being absorbed by the floating magic manual. "This book of... Ugh! Yours is pretty impressive." Kasenhis looked at the bloodied mess of a hand on the grinding wheel, then at Lupin, who was barely holding on. "You can scream, you know. The first time this thing got me, I screamed like Tom the cat." "Ah! No need. I think I can handle it." Soon, as the magic manual slowly closed, Kasenhis pulled out Dittany and bandages. The grinding wheel, at its core, was just physical damage. A few minutes with Dittany and it would be fine. Kasenhis, on the other hand, held onto the magic manual, using the magic monocle to analyze the symbols on the pages. Some symbols had labels for human and magic, while others were marked as beast. Before long, he had sorted the 2 types of symbols, but figuring out how to erase them was a trickier issue. "Is this stuff really that complicated?" Lupin clenched his fist, feeling his hand had more or less healed, before moving closer to take a look. "Honestly, I think it's manageable. Let's give it a try first." Kasenhis placed an enchanting table on the ground, where 3 floating lapis lazuli stones swirled above it, and then directly shoved Lupin onto it. Poor Lupin was immediately seized by the enchantment table's powerful magic, floating in midair. What the hell is happening?" Kasenhis didn't say anything, just flipped through the floating book on the enchantment table, which recorded Lupin's 3 types of symbols. "Well, damn!" he muttered in surprise. "What is it?" Lupin asked. "Nothing." Kasenhis shook his head. He couldn't exactly tell Lupin that he'd just made him suffer for no reason. It's not like he had prior experience with this after all. Last time he used the grinding wheel, it was to grind ender pearls. This was the first time he was grinding a person. How was he supposed to know the enchanting table would directly display a person's magical symbols? Still, their previous efforts weren't entirely wasted, at least this time. Kasenhis didn't have to manually identify the symbols. "All done? Get down from there." He pulled Lupin off the enchanting table. "Pack up, we're going to find Dumbledore." Lupin pressed his lips together. "Has Dumbledore ever helped you perform this kind of ritual magic before?" "Nope." "Then how did you whoosh teleport like that?" "I enchanted myself." "Then just enchant me too. It's just the 2 of us." "You enchanted yourself, right?" "I trust your craftsmanship," Lupin said. "How can I be responsible for your life when I can barely be responsible for my own?" Kasenhis frowned. "I can take responsibility for myself." "Oh, and then you'd want me to be an accomplice in your death? Besides, aren't you on good terms with Dumbledore? What are you so afraid of seeing him for?" Kasenhis packed up the enchanting table and the grinding wheel, then looked seriously at Lupin. "You're a professor. If one of your best students left Hogwarts and accomplished nothing, spent half his life struggling at the bottom of the wizarding world, and even, never mind, just that part, what would you think of him?" "I'd think he's suffered a lot of hardships he shouldn't have had to endure." "What else am I supposed to think?" "Trust me, Dumbledore and I probably think the same way. Otherwise, how do you think I got the money to hire you as my bodyguard?" Kasenhis explained. This doesn't even count as hiring. It's not like you couldn't handle things yourself. It's more like charity than payment. Lupin shook his head. Oh, come on. You were going to sell a 5-galleon crystal for 500 galleons. And now you have some kind of moral purity complex. That's different. Take what you can get, right? I didn't take 500 though, you gave me 10. Besides, in wizarding business of Nocturn Alley, it's not really. Lupin's face turned a bit red. There you go then. Enchanting a human body is incredibly dangerous, you know? Ever heard of 9 deaths, 1 survival? In real terms, that's a 10% success rate. Now let's not waste time and go. Right now. What, are you worried about the time difference between Brazil and England making him fall asleep? Hogwarts #1 night owl, and you think he'd be sleeping? The next moment, Cassen grabbed Lupin's shoulders and looked at him with a puzzled look. Don't you know that I can't apparate? Not only that, I'm also afraid that you'll run away secretly. The world is so big, it'll be difficult to catch you back. He added. All right. Lupin sighed and pulled out his wand, giving it a wave. Snap. After countless apparitions, they popped in front of the castle. Now it's my turn. Cassen smiled toothily. Home. Hogwarts headmaster's office. I can only say, you've finally decided to see me. Dumbledore smiled as he looked at the 2 figures appearing in his office, his gaze settling on Lupin. Lupin nodded and, somewhat awkwardly, sat down in a chair. Professor, I have a question. If someone who was once considered a promising student leaves Hogwarts, loses that aura, and spends his years struggling at the bottom, how would you see him? He must have suffered many hardships that he shouldn't have had to endure, Dumbledore answered without hesitation. Kasenhis made a noise that sounded oddly like a villager's hum of approval, then stood up and placed the enchanting table in the center of the office. All right, let's begin. Lupin took a deep breath and stepped onto the enchantment table. Almost immediately, the magic lifted him into the air. With a 10% success rate, I'm basically handing my life over to you, he muttered. Dumbledore turned to Kasenhis. Didn't you say last time that the probability was closer to 74%? Maybe even higher. Don't sweat the small details. Kasenhis quickly waved off, flipping through the enchantment book. Originally, this was supposed to be a job for the grinding wheel. But, well, you're a human, and those symbols regenerate with your body's natural healing process. So, the grinding wheel won't work. The only option is to forcibly erase them using the enchanting table. As he spoke, Kasenhis carefully compared the symbols one by one, marking each one belonging to the beast category. Chapter 75 Curing Lupin's Lycanthropy. After finishing everything, Kasenhis stopped where he was and turned to look at Dumbledore through his monocle. Nice glasses, Dumbledore remarked. Thanks. I was just making sure what the symbols of a normal person should look like. Want to try the grinding wheel? Kasenhis asked. I am always willing to dedicate myself for my students, Dumbledore said as he extended his hand. But will it hurt? Pfft. Forget it. When this is over, I'll buy you a drink as an apology for grinding your hand, Kasenhis said awkwardly before summoning another enchantment table and gesturing for Dumbledore to step onto it. Ow! Cassen and Lupin, stings, doesn't it? As Dumbledore's symbols appeared in the enchantment book, Kasenhis carefully checked through them. Once he confirmed that not a single one belonged to the beast category, he finally sighed in relief. After letting Dumbledore step down, he immediately turned back to verify Lupin's enchantment. The moment it was completed, Lupin felt something being drawn out of his body. To be honest, he had never felt his body so light before, never sensed his magic flowing so freely. And then he promptly passed out thud. The instant he stepped off the enchantment table, he collapsed onto the floor. What's going on? Kasenhis had just finished putting away the enchanting table when he turned around to see Lupin knocked out cold. Dumbledore crouched down and ran his wand over Lupin's body, examining him carefully. Nothing serious. If his body was once filled with both magic and lycanthropy, then now that the lycanthropy has been erased, his remaining magic alone isn't enough to sustain his current physical condition. He just needs a few days of rest. Oh. I see. Kasenhis nodded, then glanced at the golden apple that had appeared in his hand. Well, since he already had it, might as well, right? Chomp. That sounded quite appetizing, Dumbledore said calmly. It's kind of like a recovery potion. Want to try it? Kasenhis held the golden apple up to Dumbledore's mouth. Shouldn't you be giving that to Remus instead? Then you chew it up and feed it to him. I'm not about to do that. Kasenhis handed the bitten golden apple to Dumbledore, gathered up a few scattered books from the floor, and leisurely strolled out of the headmaster's office. Before leaving, he glanced back at Lupin, still lying motionless on the floor. Human magic. I'm a fucking genius. With Lupin's T1 event now successfully resolved, that only left a T2 event returning to his office. After traveling around the world for so long, who knew what kind of disaster had unfolded in there? For all he knew, his ender chest might have turned into a surprise gift fountain again. Opening the office door, he wasn't even surprised. As expected, it was chaos. It took him the better part of a day to reorganize everything. Once that was done, he set aside a small section of his office for a new project. His previous plan to grow magic crystals? Completely scrapped. Because he had discovered something important, so-called magic crystals didn't start out that way. They were just normal crystals that absorbed magic over time and became magic crystals. That meant that even if he successfully grew crystals, they'd still just be regular, non-magical crystals. But, after spending half the night devouring the arcane manual, he finally found a way to create actual magic crystals. All he had to do was use his wand to transmute a cauldron into an alchemical crucible. Once that was done, he could use the crucible to produce magic crystal shards. Shards? Whatever. If he needed bigger ones, he could just craft them together. No big deal. But, of course, this brought up a few awkward little issues. First off, Kasenhis had successfully transmuted an alchemical crucible, and, well, let's just say it had the durability of a bank vault. In simple terms, normal everlasting flames couldn't even heat it up. Typically, fire transfers heat from the hot part to the cold part. But if the cooling effect is stronger than the heating effect, like, say, the heat is leaking away faster than a magma block can supply it, then the fire just poofs out. Gone. Extinguished. Like a candle in the wind. Fuck. So, before he could even use the crucible, he needed to learn another spell, one that was conveniently recorded in the arcane manual. It was called Shining Radiance. Basically, a perpetual energy source that emitted infinite light and infinite heat. And learning this spell? Super easy, barely an inconvenience. All he had to do was grab a piece of paper, pick up a pen, and start solving math-heavy alchemy equations. Yet, it was basically a chemistry problem, breaking down elements, analyzing their properties, and theoretically synthesizing shining radiance. Once he figured out the theory, he just had to apply it in real life, control the right elemental forces, and cast the spell. A true STEM magic moment. But before he could do that, Kasenhis ran into yet another prerequisite. He needed more elements to construct his theories. And right now, he only had a handful: earth, water, air, fire, chaos, order, plus a few from his experiments: human magic, and beast. Not nearly enough. This is getting ridiculous. Am I actually serving a sentence here? Kasenhis slumped into his chair, visibly frustrated. Fast forward to the dead of night, and he was back on the prowl. He stepped out of his office, activating his monocle, scanning everything within sight to extract more elemental data. Of course, Kasenhis wasn't dumb enough to just start randomly pointing his magic Google lens at anything and everything. He just needed enough of the basic elements before he could get back to his desk and craft higher level ones. By combining these foundational elements, he started synthesizing more advanced ones, following the arcane manual's instructions. Soon, he built a magical machine core. The deconstruction table, which he called a deconstruction workbench. This beauty could break down ordinary materials into elemental components. And guess what Kasenhis had a mountain of? Ordinary materials. Talk about a match made in heaven. But standing next to the deconstruction workbench all day, manually feeding blocks into it? No way. Time to engineer some automation. With chests, hoppers, minecarts, rails, the workbench, and a well-laid redstone circuit, he could build a fully automatic deconstruction system. There was just one tiny problem. His office was too small. There simply wasn't enough room to set up his mini-industrial revolution. Kasenhis rubbed his chin in thought. Then, he took action. He packed up all the valuable and sentimental items in his office. Then, in his hand, a small, shimmering crystal began to form. An ender crystal. Boom. Chapter 76 Full Moon. Dumbledore, who had been experimenting with juicing a golden apple, was so startled by the explosion that he almost hurled the fruit straight into Lupin's face. Well, almost, but in the end, the result was the same. He had been planning to juice the apple to wake Lupin up, but the explosion scaring him awake worked just as well. Wrong route, correct result. Dumbledore and Lupin exchanged a glance. The latter asked, "What just happened?" The former sighed, massaging the bridge of his nose. "I don't even need to check. I already know who's responsible for that explosion." With that, he took another bite of his apple and resigned himself to heading out. Lupin, of course, immediately followed. The two of them arrived at the southern side of Hogwarts, where the alchemy professor's office was supposed to be. As they opened the door and stepped inside, they both froze. For a moment, it felt as if they had just walked into a massive open plaza. Just by surface area alone, this office now seemed to rival the size of the Black Lake. Dumbledore was so thrown off that he immediately approached outside the castle to take a look. Slowly but surely, he began to relax. Kasenhis had not, in a fit of madness, caused a massive bulge to appear on the southern wall of Hogwarts. No, the expansion had been painstakingly detailed, seamlessly integrated from the basement up to the ground, first, second, and third floor? Well, whatever the case, it looked just like the rest of the castle: dark stone walls, Gothic structure, perfectly matching Hogwarts' original design. Satisfied, he approached back inside, finding that the ground floor of Kasenhis' new addition was completely empty. The first floor, however, had been fully renovated into an enormous classroom, complete with a brand new sign already in place, Alchemy Classroom. Beside the podium, there was a staircase leading up to the second floor, which, unsurprisingly, was the alchemy professor's office. Dumbledore, astounded by Kasenhis' civil engineering expertise, then proceeded up to the third floor. Well, at least this one wasn't completely insane. Compared to the second floor, the third floor was much smaller, designed as a simple living space rather than another massive expansion. Lupin, who had followed him up, also looked around in surprise. This layout was almost identical to Kasenhis' apartment at 222 Baker Street. A living room, bathroom, study, bedroom, all fully equipped. There was even a kitchen and a huge terrace. Ah, when it comes to living in comfort, I must admit, I pale in comparison, Dumbledore remarked with a sigh. Meanwhile, down on the second floor, Kasenhis knocked out an entire wall, replacing it with a massive floor-to-ceiling window that offered a perfect view of the inky black waters of the Great Lake. Ha, and now the last part. And done. He then set up various light fixtures, and with that, the office was complete. So? You two finished touring my brand new office yet? Yet? Dumbledore chuckled, shaking his head. This office is so big, it even has an echo. Echo. It's not bad, right? I'll be building a lot more things in here in the future, Kasenhis said. It does look impressive, Dumbledore admitted. However, you still haven't done anything about my headmaster's office. There was even a hint of grievance in his tone. Next time, for sure. Next time, for sure. I mean it. You have to trust me. I believe you. I'm heading to bed. Remus, you'll be staying at Hogwarts for a while, at least until the full moon. Dumbledore wobbled his way out of the alchemy office. Me? Where am I supposed to stay? Lupin looked utterly lost, glancing from Dumbledore's retreating figure to Kasenhis. The latter simply pointed upstairs toward the living quarters. Same layout as 222 Baker Street. Find yourself a spot. Thanks. Lupin had a dangerous look in his eyes. Hey! Why are you looking at me like this? Hey! Lupin walked over and pulled Kasenhis into a big hug. Come to think of it, this was probably the first time in a long while he'd done something like this. Okay. Now enough with the hug. It's nothing. You could have just gone to the hospital wing and crashed there too. It's not just about this, Lupin said with tears coming out of his eyes. All right, no need to get sentimental. Now go and check that room of yours or I'll change my mind. After shooing Lupin upstairs, Kasenhis stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing at the moon hanging in the night sky. Waxing gibbous, 3/4 full. His monocle effortlessly scanned the lunar phase, shoving yet another random piece of knowledge into his already overflowing brain. Shame I can't scan the moon for elemental properties. Muttering to himself, he turned away from the window, pulled out a structure workbench and some redstone components, and got to work on building a fully automated deconstruction machine. The next morning, Lupin groggily stumbled downstairs from the third floor only to be met with an absolute monstrosity of a gigantic machine. Even though it was completely enclosed within a meter-thick glass panel, he could still feel the sheer, overwhelming presence emanating from within. Meanwhile, Kasenhis was slumped in a boss chair in the corner of the office, fast asleep. Lupin pulled out his wand, gave it a little flick, and Kasenhis floated up into the air, obediently drifting after him to his bedroom. After depositing him in the bedroom, Lupin headed off to find some food. Kasenhis slept straight through to the evening. Ugh, my sleep schedule is ruined. No more all-nighters tonight, gotta chug a bottle of invigoration draft. Still in a daze, he shuffled downstairs, gazing fondly at the fully operational automated deconstruction machine, which was now steadily cranking out elemental components. All that time watching Redstone tutorials wasn't wasted after all. This was the true power of Redstone automation. He wandered toward the floor-to-ceiling window, turning his gaze eastward to where a bright white disk was slowly rising into the sky. Full moon. Guess I won't be sleeping just yet. Leaving the castle, he headed down to Black Lake where he found Lupin out for a jog. Today's the full moon, Kasenhis remarked. Lupin turned back to look at him, his expression a little tense. Which was understandable. It was like that moment right before getting an exam paper back where top students wondered if they got 100 or 99, average students debated between 80 or 60, and failing students just hoped their score had 2 digits instead of 1. No matter what kind of student you were, everyone felt that same looming sense of fear before the result was revealed. The only difference was what exactly they feared. I thought it was still a few days away, kinda lost track, Lupin admitted, awkwardly scratching the back of his head. Because we were in Brazil before. Now we're in England. The full moon's earlier here, Kasenhis explained, taking a seat beside him, both of them staring out over the dark waters of the Black Lake. Yeah, it's closed now, any moment. Lupin exhaled. Then suddenly, oh, right Cassen, maybe you should back up a bit. Just in case. I mean, it's not that I don't trust you, but if there's even a chance the werewolf curse wasn't completely removed, I'd rather not accidentally hurt you. No need for that. I have 100% confidence in my craftsmanship, Kasenhis replied firmly. Lupin wasn't convinced. Without saying a word, he shifted slightly further away, and in a very subtle, yet very telling move sat on his own hands. This way, if he did start transforming into a werewolf, his instinctive reaction would throw him off balance at the very least, giving Kasenhis enough time to draw his wand. Soon, the sun completely set, and the silver-white full moon hung high in the sky. Lupin tilted his head back, staring blankly at the glowing orb above. At some point without even realizing it, a single tear slipped from the corner of his eye. Chapter 77 Flourish and Blotts. Over the next month, Kasenhis used this enchantment book method to cure 6 more werewolves. Including Lupin and Marcus, that made a total of 8 werewolves successfully cured. At the same time, the combined use of the enchanting table and the enchantment book for curing werewolves was officially published as a paper. This time, it wasn't just a small alchemy community journal, it took up 2 full pages in the Daily Prophet, providing a detailed but censored explanation of the process. Additionally, it included testimonies from the 8 cured werewolf wizards and an announcement. On the day of the full moon, a small stall in Diagon Alley would distribute free enchanted books, and Professor Kasenhis of Hogwarts would be present to provide a basic tutorial on how to use the enchantment table and enchantment book. Essentially, it was going to be a brief but official launch event. Meanwhile, inside the Ministry of Magic. This is the security force we've arranged for your so-called enchantment book distribution, Mr. His. I hope you understand that since Diagon Alley is the most densely populated area for wizards in England, I require your absolute cooperation. If these werewolf wizards riot, or if your so-called cure fails, and these werewolves transform under tonight's full moon and begin attacking innocent witches and wizards, our aurors and hit wizards will immediately suppress them. If necessary, we will eliminate them. You are not to interfere, you will not resist, and you will not lead them in resistance or aid them in escaping justice. Rufus Scrimgeour, head of the Auror office, spoke to Kasenhis with an expression as serious as stone. Of course, Kasenhis nodded in agreement, waving a hand casually. To be honest, if it weren't for the fact that most werewolves have terrible mobility, I would have held the event in the middle of nowhere. But unfortunately, he continued with a sigh, werewolf wizards as strong as Remus Lupin are incredibly rare. In fact, most of them don't even qualify to take the apparition exam. It's good that you understand. After leaving the Ministry of Magic, Kasenhis blinked and appeared at the small stall he had set up for the event. On the table, there was an enchanting table and a counter, while below it, a small box was filled with enchantment books. Very quickly, a huge crowd of werewolf wizards gathered, completely surrounding the small stall. However, compared to the entire wizarding population, werewolves were still a minority, so their presence didn't cause any major chaos in Diagon Alley. Of course, that was also because waves of aurors were stationed around, maintaining strict order, and the werewolf wizards themselves had no intention of causing trouble. The ones who had long embraced the wild, those who enjoyed preying on the weak, didn't even bother showing up. Before long, the last werewolf wizard had their werewolf symbols completely erased. Kasenhis collapsed into his chair, stretching so hard his bones cracked. Soon after, the aurors escorted the newly cured werewolf wizards to the Ministry's designated testing chambers. There, they would undergo a final trial, waiting until the light of the full moon shone upon them. If not a single hair sprouted from their bodies, the cure was officially proven. As for the professor responsible for all of this, he had already passed out in bed, entering a deep sleep before anyone could bother him. The next day. You know, the last time I went to Flourish and Blotts to buy some alchemy books, the shopkeeper Merlin knows why sold me a butchered alchemy textbook. Kasenhis yawned, flipping through a rather disappointing book in his hands. The book is so badly censored, it doesn't even have runes in it. Since then, I swore that the next time I saw him, I'd make sure to teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. So, now that I've said all this, can you tell me, do you know that person or not? Kasenhis and Lupin were sitting across from the owner of Flourish and Blotts, who was currently shivering in fear, already regretting letting that damned employee take the day off yesterday. All right, I won't make things difficult for you, Kasenhis said, glancing around at the bookstore packed with customers before deciding to find a quiet corner to sit down. Meanwhile, Lupin, looking bored out of his mind, had picked up a random book and was flipping through it. Go ahead, I'm listening, the bookstore owner said nervously. Yesterday, across the street from your shop, I cured a bunch of werewolf wizards. You saw the front page of the Daily Prophet today, right? Of course. Front page news, can't exactly miss it. Ahem, so I'm here to talk about, working together for the betterment of the wizarding world. And also to discuss a business deal. Kasenhis reached into his pocket and pulled out a werewolf curse removal enchantment book. I'm setting the price at 1 galleon per book. I'd like to entrust Flourish and Blotts with the distribution. The bookstore owner's face twisted with concern. 1 galleon? For a book this valuable? Don't you want to price it higher? Look over there, that idiot doing a book signing? His garbage book is going for 10 galleons each, and he's selling out. Your book is worth way more. Werewolves can barely afford a single nut, let alone 10 galleons. 1 galleon is already enough to filter out those who genuinely want to escape their condition from those who don't. Besides, you don't even have to spend a single nut to stock these books, I'll supply them for free. Kasenhis enthusiastically patted the bookstore owner's shoulder, grinning as if he had just secured the best deal of the century. Oh my! Well, if that's the case, I suppose it's not entirely unreasonable. So, we have a deal, then? Kasenhis asked, smiling. Yes. I'll head to Hogwarts to pick them up later. Since you're not making any money from this, it wouldn't be right to make you go out of your way. I'll advertise it properly and provide clear instructions. Those wizards looking to rid themselves of their werewolf curse will come on their own. See? That's why you have such a big heart, store owner. As he spoke, Kasenhis casually pulled out a long wooden box, flipping it open to reveal a neatly stacked pile of werewolf curse removal enchantment books. You already brought them? Of course. I foresaw it. I knew you were a good man, owner. The bookstore owner, now officially certified as a good man, didn't say much. He simply picked up the box and started placing books on the shelves. Meanwhile, Kasenhis and Lupin exchanged glances. Not bad, right? I never expected that I'd have this much influence outside of the alchemy circles, Kasenhis mused. I think this is where we part ways for now. I won't be going back to Hogwarts. I've spent years drifting aimlessly as a werewolf, but now it's time I took some time to put my life back in order. I hope everything falls into place for you soon, Kasenhis said sincerely. Just as the two were about to step out of Flourish and Blotts, a sudden commotion erupted from inside the bookstore. Professor Kasenhis. Merlin's sweaty socks. That's really Professor Kasenhis. What? Was the need to add sweaty in there? Kasenhis, completely bewildered, turned around only to be met with the synchronized gaze of nearly half the third years and above in the bookstore, all staring straight at him. As for Lupin, he hadn't left yet either. Not because he was particularly interested in the commotion but because, when he turned around instinctively, he caught sight of a very familiar figure. An incredibly familiar figure. Chapter 7-8 Let him reflect on his life choices. In an instant, the young wizard surged forward like a tidal wave. Kasenhis's expression shifted immediately as he debated whether it would be considered rude to just teleport away on the spot. That moment of hesitation was all it took. He was trapped. The students swarmed around him, chirping excitedly. Even Lupin, who had been watching, was a little stunned. However, his moment of distraction lasted only a second. He remained by Kasenhis's side, though his gaze subtly shifted toward a small, familiar figure in the crowd. Professor Kasenhis, I really didn't expect to run into you here. A tall, red-haired man approached, placing a firm hand on the heads of the Weasley twins while politely addressing him. Hello. Hello, hello. I'm Arthur Weasley. You've taught these two Weasley boys. I truly appreciate all the guidance you've given them. It's nothing, really it's their own talent at work. Watching this scene, Draco Malfoy, who had originally intended to approach Kasenhis, suddenly stopped in his tracks as if he wanted to avoid anything and anyone associated with the Weasley family at all costs. Meanwhile, outside the bookstore, Lucius Malfoy reflected on his real reason for coming here. His mission was complete, and he had successfully slipped that dark magic notebook into the Weasley family's hands. A sinister smile curled on his lips. Back inside, Gilderoy Lockhart, who had been performing a grand stage play atop a table, finally noticed that his fanbase had suddenly shrunk by about 70%, leaving behind only a few clueless first years. At that moment, Lockhart lost all interest in continuing his performance. Instead, he strode towards the crowd that had stolen his audience, determined to see for himself who dared to outshine him. Meanwhile, Kasenhis, who was struggling to fend off an onslaught of gossip-fueled questions from the young wizards, suddenly noticed a hand reaching out toward him. Instinctively, he grasped it, looking up. What the? Why is this guy showing all his teeth like this? And you are? Me? I'm Gilderoy Lockhart. The best-selling author of the wizarding world. Kasenhis was forced to endure an endless stream of self-promotional nonsense, until finally, he managed to catch a single useful piece of information. A third-class Order of Merlin. Yes, my third-class Order of Merlin. It was awarded to me 3 years ago for saving a poor werewolf. That werewolf, what was his name again? It was. Lockhart's momentum faltered as he completely forgot the name, which made sense, considering he had never actually done any of it himself. And since he hadn't bothered to make up a name in his books, there was nothing for him to remember. But just as the situation threatened to turn embarrassingly awkward, he had a stroke of genius, a move worthy of Conan Doyle's greatest detectives. Casually, his eyes darted down to a crumpled, footprint-covered newspaper on the floor. Oh, right. That werewolf was none other than Remus Lupin. I even taught him an alchemical method to remove the werewolf curse. Imagine my delight when I read the newspaper this morning and saw that a certain alchemist had used my very method to cure him. I was overjoyed. A dear friend of mine has finally received the bright future he deserves. As Lockhart continued his endless self-praise, internally, he was already plotting his next move. Tonight, he would track down that werewolf wizard and the so-called alchemist, cast a quick obliviate on both of them, and erase their memories. After all, if they forgot everything, he could swoop in and claim to be the true mastermind behind the enchanted book therapy. Maybe even get another medal out of it. Meanwhile, Kasenhis and Lupin exchanged glances. Both of them could see the same thing in each other's eyes: utter confusion. And it wasn't just them. The crowd of young wizards surrounding Kasenhis fell into a synchronized silence. Some even subtly shuffled away from Lockhart. Because ever since last year, when Professor Kasenhis absolutely annihilated Quirrell on the dueling stage, sending him to the hospital wing for half a semester, they had all learned one crucial lesson. Professor Kasenhis was patient and kind. But he definitely had a limit. And when he got angry, it was terrifying. Among the sea of students, 4 seemingly unremarkable young wizards were already reaching the same conclusion. 2 of them had even discreetly drawn their wands, wondering which spell would provide Lockhart with the most enlightening, double-dose heroic experience. Meanwhile, the victim of this absurd fabrication, Kasenhis, turned his gaze toward the oily, smug wizard before him. This isn't just any ordinary idiot. This one requires special treatment. Perhaps something more immersive like burying him underground for a few days? Who knows? Maybe by autumn, they'd have a whole harvest of mini Lockharts. Actually, never mind. That was unnecessary. Unlike the polite and composed Kasenhis, Lupin, on the other hand. He was a man of action. Almost instantly, without any hesitation, a powerful surge of magic erupted from Lupin, pinning Lockhart against the wall. "I am Remus Lupin," Lupin stated, his voice cold and sharp. "When, exactly, did we ever meet?" The crowd of young witches and wizards, who had been watching intently, finally let out delighted smiles. Ah, yes. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Satisfying. Lockhart's face twisted in shock. "Why you Remus Lupin?" Lupin nodded calmly. "Not only that, but when exactly did you teach me the enchanted book therapy? 3 years ago, was it? Did enchanted books even exist back then?" The Weasley twins, grinning ear to ear, chimed in for support. 3 years ago, Professor Kasenhis was still following his old mentor around. Maybe he invented it early and just forgot to tell everyone. Wait. Lockhart frantically waved his hands, his usual confident smirk melting into full-blown panic. I misspoke. I meant to say that I told the alchemist about it. I got confused, that's all." The crowd immediately turned their gazes to Kasenhis, their eyes full of expectation. And Kasenhis, feeling mildly embarrassed, scratched his chin and casually strolled forward. As he did, he activated his enchanted monocle, casually scanning Lockhart. Human magic. TCH. Unfortunately, not a cockroach. This guy is actually human? Unbelievable. Weird. Very weird. Kasenhis cleared his throat. Ahem, yes, I'm Kasenhis. I'm that alchemist you were talking about. Lockhart's smile shattered like a glass window hit by a bludger. A wave of existential dread crashed over him, the kind that screamed. Welp, guess this is the end for me. This is all just a misunderstanding. Lockhart gulped, forcing an awkward, trembling smile. Would you believe me if I said it was just a joke? Kasenhis nodded thoughtfully. You know what? You're absolutely right. Lockhart's shoulders visibly relaxed. This is just a misunderstanding. And then snap. With a casual flick of his fingers, a diamond shovel materialized in Kasenhis' hand. Then, with another lazy wave, a group of students eagerly gathered around. Kasenhis grinned. All right, listen up. With a smooth motion, he summoned a whole stack of diamond shovels and distributed them among the students. Take these, he said, still smiling. Find a nice, quiet spot. Students, yes. Cassen, then dig a hole. Students, okay. Cassen, and bury him for a bit. Let him reflect on his life choices. Students, kakik. The students exchanged looks, their grins slowly morphing into something truly sinister. Then, in unison, they all snatched up the shovels. I, Captain. Chapter 79 Second Year, Attack from the Air? Hold up. Don't bury him just yet. This book I read said if you mix water with the dirt, it turns into mud, and then it hardens better once it sets. Much sturdier burial. You lot, don't just stand there, someone grab his wand. How exactly are we burying him? What do you mean? Like, head down or feet down? You seriously don't know? Head down, obviously. Lockhart's eyes widened in sheer panic as he listened to the cold, matter-of-fact discussion about his burial. I think this is completely unnecessary. He stammered. Hey, Joey, where's your sock? Shove it in his mouth. On it. Opening feast, Hogwarts. Honestly, Kasenhis muttered, standing by his office's floor-to-ceiling window, arms crossed. The fact that he actually managed to dig himself out of the mud. He shook his head, turning to Dumbledore, who sipped tea with his usual serene amusement. I gotta admit, Kasenhis sighed, that's some serious talent right there. I'm really grateful that you understand me. I'm basically at Snape's level now, fully embracing the art of not caring. Honestly, a hypocritical clown is still an upgrade from last year's Quirrell. Looking at it that way, Dumbledore, you've actually improved your hiring standards this year, Kasenhis said, half joking. Ha ha ha, yes, indeed, Dumbledore nodded, completely agreeing without a trace of guilt. And at the end of the day, he'll only last a year. By this time next year, you won't see him here anymore. Because of that curse? The one on the defense against the dark arts post. Yes. As long as the person who cast it is alive, the curse won't break. Dumbledore sighed. But honestly, that's not even the worst part. The real problem is that besides Lockhart no one else even applied. Originally, I wanted Lupin to take the position, but he's still, well, sorting out his life. I'm more curious about why Lockhart even had the guts to apply. Well, he already signed the magical contract before you lot buried him in the dirt. Too late for regrets. Kasenhis nodded, then casually shuffled a bit closer to Dumbledore. By the way, Dumbledore, remember what you promised me before the holidays? Let me think. Dumbledore suddenly murmured, eyes drifting to the distance. Oh. I left my wool socks drying on the windowsill. Can't let outsiders see that, how embarrassing. He turned immediately, trying to make a graceful escape from the alchemy office. Only for Kasenhis to catch up in 3 quick strides. Lockhart wasn't interviewed in your office. Kasenhis smirked. So what's your excuse now? Didn't I already give you the Philosopher's Stone? See, that's a completely separate matter. The Philosopher's Stone is one thing, but the wages of a poor, underpaid professor is another. We can't mix the two. Kasenhis said with a completely serious expression. Fine, fine. Come to my office, we'll sign a new contract. By evening, Kasenhis was comfortably lounging in his chair, basking in the joy of victory. After some fierce negotiations, he had successfully secured himself a much better salary. Meanwhile, at the other end of the professor's table, in the darkest, most miserable corner, Lockhart was mechanically chewing his food, his soul already halfway out of his body. When he had first accepted Dumbledore's invitation to teach defense against the dark arts, he had been ecstatic. It was perfect. He could boost his reputation among the students, increase his book sales, and rake in loads of gold. But that was before. Before he had been dragged out of Flourish and Blotts, buried head down in the dirt by a horde of small but terrifying Hogwarts students, with only a single pipe left for him to breathe through. It was in that pitch-black, suffocating moment that he realized his mistake. Now, sitting in the Great Hall, he could already foresee his bleak, miserable year ahead. And then, there was Kasenhis. A single wave of his hand, and a swarm of students would immediately rush over to do his bidding. What kind of professor had that much authority? Lockhart stared at him with pure horror. This wasn't a normal professor. This was organized crime. Hogwarts under Kasenhis wasn't a school. It was a military dictatorship. Ugh! I suddenly felt a chill. Kasenhis heard the sharp screech of a knife scraping against a plate, a sound so unholy that it sent a chill down his spine. His gaze drifted towards the source. And there sat Lockhart, butchering his dinner with a level of vengeance usually reserved for ancient grudges. Kasenhis narrowed his eyes, deep in thought. How could he bait this guy into a full-on, high-stakes wizard duel? A proper explosive battle. One filled with blood-pumping adrenaline and spell fire. After all, it wasn't like they couldn't find a substitute teacher for defense against the dark arts. Snape would gladly take over. In fact, he'd probably thank him. But before he could finalize his genius plan, something caught his eye. 2 small figures lingering awkwardly at the edge of his vision, trying very hard to exist without existing. He put on his best act, casually scanning the room like a detective. Once he was sure that no other professors were paying attention, he leisurely got up from his seat and followed the 2 figures out of the Great Hall. Outside, he crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. All right, what's up? Harry and Ron are missing. Hermione blurted out, her face full of worry. Kasenhis' first instinct was logic. We should tell Dumbledore immediately. A missing student is not a minor issue. But Professor, Neville hesitated, will they get expelled if we tell him? Kasenhis opened his mouth to reassure them, but then he froze. His eyes locked onto something in the sky. Something large. Something rapidly approaching Hogwarts. A flying object. And wait. Hold up. Is a Muggle airstrike incoming? Kasenhis tilted his head back, adjusting his monocle to analyze the object. Mechanical magical. Oh. Never mind. Not a Muggle attack. Then what is it? Hermione asked, still anxious. Kasenhis squinted at the approaching vehicle. It's an alchemically enhanced flying machine. Probably some reckless young wizard's pet project. He stopped. His brain short-circuited. His face froze in absolute disbelief. Sitting in the driver's seat of that magical death trap, gripping the wheel with equal parts terror and excitement, were two very familiar figures. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Hermione, Kasenhis sighed, rubbing his temples, I'm afraid I have some very bad news for you. She gulped. This year, Gryffindor will be starting at negative points. Before she could protest, Kasenhis vanished in an instant. The next second, he reappeared beside a rickety old shack, wand already raised towards the incoming disaster from above an alchemically enhanced flying car, diving straight down like it was auditioning for the Ghost Riders of Doom. His reaction was immediate. With a flick of his wand, an entire webbed net burst into existence between the ground and the sky, spanning the area like a giant spider's lair. HHHH. Thud. The car slammed into the thick magical threads, its momentum absorbed by the intricate layers. Slowly, gracefully, like it was giving Sir Isaac Newton the respect he deserved, the car descended safely to the ground. Because, at the end of the day, Casenhis was a generous man. Another casual wave of his wand, and the webs vanished into thin air. Now, with the dust settled, Kasenhis finally got a proper look at the two troublemakers inside the vehicle. Harry was the first to climb out, grinning like he'd just pulled off the greatest stunt in wizarding history. That was terrible. Oh. Cool glasses, Professor, he greeted, brushing dirt off his robes. I meant to say that back in Flourish and Blotts, but you know, too many people. Kasenhis nodded. Yeah, I was very aware of that situation. But now, he gestured to the wreckage, would you like to explain why exactly you and Ron are piloting a flying death machine? Harry hesitated. If you can spin me a tale that at least pretends to follow basic logic, and if your decision-making process doesn't make me want to launch myself off the astronomy tower. You won't take points off? Harry asked hopefully. Kasenhis smirked. I'll consider deducting only 1,000 points instead. 1,000? Each. Well, there's two of you, aren't there? Ron groaned, already accepting his fate. The barrier to platform 9 3/4 was sealed, Professor. We had no choice. We thought. Kasenhis raised a brow. Oh? So the best solution was to hijack a magic car and fly it across the country like some bootleg stunt pilots. Ron gave him a tired look. Professor. He sighed. Would you just take the points? Hermione somewhere in the castle, excuse me? Chapter 80 Illogical Alchemy. Is that so, Ron? Oh. I see now, Kasenhis said, rubbing his chin with mock contemplation. So platform 9 3/4 suddenly closed for unknown reasons, and instead of, say, going back home and asking Mrs. Weasley for help, you two brilliant minds just went, oh well, guess we'll hijack this poor little alchemical vehicle and fly ourselves to school. He clapped his hands together twice as if applauding their phenomenal decision-making. A fantastic experience. A truly creative solution, Kasenhis said, voice dripping with sarcasm. So Gryffindor loses 70 points. After last year's shameless moment where Dumbledore opened his mouth and gifted Gryffindor an extra 150 points at the last second, Kasenhis had long since stopped taking the point system seriously. After all, with both Snape and Dumbledore constantly manipulating the scoreboard, Hogwarts house points were experiencing an inflation crisis. A little personal touch here and there wouldn't make a difference. Ah. I thought you would deduct 1,000 points. So, Professor, does that mean this is the end of it? Harry asked, hopeful. Kasenhis shook his head. Absolutely not. Professor McGonagall is definitely going to hear about this. Harry groaned. Ron groaned harder. Completely ignoring their misery, Kasenhis casually climbed into the driver's seat of the beat-up little alchemical car. This was made by Mr. Weasley, I assume. Yeah, Ron said, puffing his chest proudly. Not bad work, Kasenhis admitted. Now I know where the Weasley twins got their alchemy talent from. Ron beamed. But, Kasenhis continued, Ron, where do you live? Ron blinked. The Borough, outside Ottery St. Catchpole, in Devon. Why? Kasenhis hummed, tapped the dashboard, made a few adjustments, and then casually stepped out of the vehicle. Immediately, the car lifted into the air, slowly ascending before smoothly vanishing from sight. It was flying itself back to the Borough. Now, if you hurry back, you might just manage to fill your stomachs before Professor McGonagall finds you. But do eat quickly, her punishments won't wait forever. As the dejected young Gryffindors scurried back to the Great Hall, Kasenhis casually returned to the professor's table and, in the most nonchalant way possible, relayed the entire incident to Professor McGonagall. McGonagall, meanwhile, had just been wondering why the House Point hourglasses were completely empty at the start of the term, yet somehow, Gryffindor's point counter had already gained a perfectly sized gap, one just right for deducting 70 points. She had assumed it was some kind of malfunction. Turns out, some very special students had worked extra hard to provide an explanation. With a stormy expression, McGonagall stormed off towards the Gryffindor table, ready to dispense justice. Kasenhis, on the other hand, gracefully retreated to his office, carrying with him the glory of a job well done. Now, it was time to prepare for his first third-year alchemy lesson. Compared to advanced transmutations or material synthesis, perhaps a simple puppet would be the perfect starting project. Sure, it might still be a bit difficult for young third-years new to alchemy, but if he could hook them with something fun, it would be worth it. Kasenhis pulled out his arcane manual and flipped to the section on puppetry, carefully studying the details. To be honest, this was very last-minute prep work. Because, given the choice between crafting a semi-intelligent magical puppet to assist him with tasks or constructing a fully automated redstone-powered industrial machine, he definitely preferred the factory assembly line approach. Redstone engineering supremacy, baby. The next day, standing behind the lecture podium, Kasenhis looked down at a sea of over 40 eager young faces. How many students are in all 4 houses this year? 41. And how many of you are here right now? 41. Kasenhis nodded, tapping the gold-plated podium he'd salvaged from the original alchemy classroom. Well, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this time, there's no free gold. The students groaned in disappointment, but their interest returned instantly as Kasenhis reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny, dark purple figure. It looked identical to the iron golems that guarded the castle, except this one was smaller and had a sleek new paint job. This little guy is far more intelligent than an iron golem. Those big brutes are combat puppets, and, well, making those requires talent and a healthy amount of let me try thinking about it power. For you third years, that would be way beyond your skill level. A few students shifted uncomfortably at his words, while others nodded in agreement. So instead, I've brought you something much more practical and intelligent. Once you build this, you'll basically have your own low-powered house elf. You can have it carry your books to class, fetch things for you, or even assist you with alchemy experiments. Kasenhis twirled the tiny puppet between his fingers, watching as the students below leaned forward, eager to start. Satisfied, he finally pulled out a shimmering cauldron. This is an alchemy crucible, not to be confused with Professor Snape's potion cauldrons. Entirely different purpose. But the way you use them is the same. With a snap of his fingers, a dazzling burst of light illuminated every student's desk. Then, with a lazy wave of his wand, 40+ alchemy crucibles descended in an orderly line from upstairs, each one gently landing before its assigned student. Time to get crafting. When you're in potions class, has Professor Snape ever reminded you not to put any of the ingredients in your mouth? The students nodded in unison. Good. That saves me the trouble of warning you. Kasenhis flicked his wand again, and a stream of tiny element-filled vials and purple metal blocks floated down from the upper floor, neatly landing on each student's desk. I can only say this alchemy requires a certain level of let me try thinking about it power. So, try not to be too surprised by what happens next. First, grab the bucket next to your table and fill your alchemy crucible with water. Then, pick up that purple metal block. This is mystic metal, a brand new material I've created through alchemy. It will be available in alchemy supply shops after my next paper gets published. And those little vials? Human, motion, and soul elements. Those will also be hitting the shelves when my paper drops. As for how these elements are extracted, well, let's just say you're not quite there yet in your studies. The students exchanged excited glances as they followed his instructions, pouring various ingredients into the crucible just like they would in potions class. And then, as if the universe simply accepted their efforts, the cauldron spat out fully formed miniature puppets. No one knew why it worked. No one knew how it worked. But it did work. And honestly, that was just how alchemy functioned. People knew the Philosopher's Stone could transmute objects into gold, but they had no idea why it could. Since its earliest days, alchemy had been a deeply contradictory field. On one hand, if you carefully followed the steps, adding the right materials at the right time, or engraving precise runes, you could perfectly replicate past results. But for generations, no one except Nicolas managed to create the Philosopher's Stone. No alchemist had truly grasped the underlying principles behind it. Then again, magic itself was never about logic. Compared to charms and curses, alchemy and potions were already shockingly scientific.
Thanks for listening.